Well, welcome class. We are about to begin session. Thank you guys for coming to the penultimate meeting of this August Expert Advisory Committee, and I'm thrilled with our guest speakers today. Thank you guys so much for taking the effort to come in. Why don't we start with our roll call? I can see several of you online, but we'll just start from the top. I know that John Calloway is not coming and Connor is not coming. So those two are going to be absent. But Christy?
Present.
John is absent. Nathaniel? Nathaniel absent. Matt? William?
Here, present.
Laura is here. And Connor, we know, is not able to attend. And Debbie, you're here. Great. Mark.
Laurie, did you get my read-in? This is Matt. I'm
No.
sorry.
Matt,
Yeah,
great.
sorry. Three
Thank
new
you.
buttons. Well-designed office. Matt Holmes, present.
Thank you. Mark? Carrie, I know, is absent. She has a family member in the hospital. Melissa? You know, Melissa was,
I'm here.
okay. I'm here. And Marion?
Present.
Great. All right. Carrie is out.
Oh, yeah, you do.
So could we perhaps proceed to our next slide? Unless you have some other announcements.
No other announcements, just maybe going back over the agenda, because then we'll go right into the bottom slides.
So in our conversation today, an inventory reporting, monitoring, and modeling perspective. And we are really pleased to have Malcolm North, Andrew Latimer, and Amy DaCosta, I believe, is online as well. Amy, if you are online, could you in some way, shape, or form signal that you are there?
I am here.
Great, thank you. A disembodied voice will suffice with that. In this conversation, I think a core issue for us is the recognition that the single largest impact on our forested landscape is fire. So how we assess the impact of fire, how we report out emissions associated with fire, how we look at different trajectories with salvage versus non-salvage, how we look at future fire impacts and impact on the landscape in terms of both emissions and forest health, how we manage that fire in terms of future goals, and what we put into our models for the trajectories about how we look at our reforestation efforts and their likely susceptibility to fire or how they will handle fire. These are really critical issues for us to be looking at. And our speakers today all have significant expertise in these areas. So we have a great cross-section of people here. Really appreciate that both online and in person. So with that, we're going to start by asking Malcolm North to speak, and then Andrew Latimer, and then Amy DaCosta, and then we will be moving over to have Laura Kuipers doing a presentation around modeling. So there'll be the opportunity for questions as we go along, but I do want to signal that Malcolm has got to leave at 2 minutes before 2 because he has to go up to the 20th floor of the same building. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to you.
All right, thank you, Mark. There are a lot of things, I guess, that I could talk about, having worked in California for 25 years now. But I thought I'd at least kind of frame generally what I'm going to talk about on 3 topics. And please jump in and either ask me questions as you go or totally take it in a different direction if you want to ask something about some of the, other work that we've done, both with the tea kettle experiment as well as other places in the Sierra Nevada. But the three main topics I was going to talk about are what is resilience and how might we measure it in forests? What is going on in terms of carbon dynamics, and particularly I'm going to talk about a concept called carrying capacity for carbon. And then finally, I'm going to touch on reforestation and the importance of spatial patterns. So I'll try to keep this pretty brief, though. I don't want to listen to myself drone on and on. So please jump in if you've got questions along the way. So the first topic is what the hell is resilience and how would we measure it in forest systems? And it's become a pretty much an obligatory term for describing the type of forest conditions we want to have, because it's an explicit recognition that there is going to continue to be stress on the system, and you're trying to increase the bandwidth for that system to be able to absorb and come back after a particular disturbance. And most of what we focused on, rightfully so, has been fire and trying to make forests resilient or resistant to fire. And what I'm going to suggest is that what we currently focus on a lot with fuels treatments is a resistance treatment. It is not full-on resilience, and I'll explain that in a minute. But we know from both modeling and empirical studies that one of the best ways we can reduce the intensity and the large tree mortality on fires is reduction of surface fuels and microfuels. Nothing particularly new there. But I think the second question we have to raise is, what is going on in the forest between fire events, and how might that influence the very fire dynamics we're going to talk about? So I'm going to give you an example. In 2012 to 16, Sierra's had a very substantial drought, and depending on whose numbers you believe, somewhere in the order of 100 to 150 million trees died during that period of time. Subsequent to that, in 2020, we had a large fire start, the Creek Fire, on the Sierra National Forest, and burned into an area where there's substantial drought mortality. And the reason I'm talking about this is Scott Stevens did a really nice paper analyzing that fire. And Mark Finney was one of the people on that paper. Mark is probably the best fuels person in the United States that I know of. And he basically assessed, from looking at the MODIS imagery of the intensity of the fire and what was going on, that that fire burning in the very high fuel loads from the drought mortality was a mass fire event. And by mass fire event, we're talking Dresden, Tokyo, World War II. That kind of intensity. In fact, the pyrocumulus cloud that was produced by that fire went up to 55,000 feet. You can't really generate that kind of wafting without having basically a heat output that's close to a nuclear level. So there's, what I want to suggest with that is that while we need to focus on fire and what the problems are with fire, we definitely need to also focus on making the forest more resilient to other stressors, and in particular, drought and bark beetles. And so I was concerned about this because of this drought mortality, but also the fact that we've really gotten to focus on trying to deal with the fire issue and making forests resistant to fire, but that doesn't directly address how we would keep them being more resistant to drought and bark beetles. So recently did a paper, came out in 2022, proposing that we could assess resilience in forest systems by focusing on a key factor which we haven't paid that much attention to while we were looking at fuels, and that is the density of the stand. Basically, most forests can carry a certain amount of biomass depending on what type of forest type they are, and once you start exceeding that level of biomass, you end up with dramatic growth reductions in all the trees. And there's a lot of literature and research that's been done to show that as those growth reductions go down, trees can cross a threshold in which they're extremely susceptible to any type of stress. And particularly in these forests, due to the scarcity of water, bark beetles coming in, sensing that water stress, are often the coup de grace that finally kills a lot of these trees. So what we proposed is that we need to focus on fuels the way we're doing so far. But if we're going to try to make the forest, and particularly the old growth trees in the forest, survive stresses, we need to be able to reduce the competition level within the forest so that we're getting rapid, vigorous growth rates again in the system. Because when you lose that vigor, you have the problem with the bark beetles would come in and sense that, and the tree doesn't have enough water to be able to pitch out and attune the beetles. And so often that's what ends up killing the tree at the end. Fortunately, in forestry, we do have a pretty good measure for what's the density, what's the biomass on a particular site. It's called stand density index, and particularly if you relativize it against the forest type, you can produce a percentage of what the maximum is in a particular stand that you're looking at. And I won't go into much more of the detail on it. I'm happy to share this paper with anybody who's interested in it. But basically, we're suggesting that the minimum level that most forest managers are holding stands at, which is 35% of the maximum amount of biomass they could hold. Most silviculture keeps forests between 35 and 60%. And what we've been able to tell from looking at historic data and what the forest was like, forests actually, you do not want them to go over 35%. So we're suggesting something that's a little bit radical, and that the forest needs to be at a really low density condition to be able to resist the stresses from bark beetle and droughts. And I won't go into it any further than that, except if anybody wants to dive into it, I'd be happy to answer questions.
So spacing, density, what about species composition? Because these are also extraordinarily altered species composition. How much does that impact?
It plays in a lot because bark beetles in these systems, in fact, the West, but also since we're talking about Sierra Nevada, beetles are host specific. So dendrochonous pine beetles only kill pine trees. Fir engraver only goes after fir trees. And so if you put all your eggs in one basket by having a monoculture of pine or a monoculture of fir, you basically are setting the stand up for very strong effects of beetles coming in and killing the stand. So that it's a really good point, because you have to keep the density low, but you also want to diversify the species composition to make the stand work.
So both of these are metrics.
Yeah.
Yeah, so is it the case that you're really speaking to Sierra Nevada forests, or is this really general across all forest types? I'm thinking especially redwood forests. So
Yeah, no, I should have prefaced that, and thanks for pointing out. It's really focused on frequent fire forest systems. So the redwoods would not be included. It's what we're talking about mostly in montane forest systems is ponderosa, Jeffrey pine, mixed conifer, a little bit of the red fir zone system, but basically the same forest types that we have real problem wildfires in. And the reason is because, as best as we can tell, those fires were frequent enough that these forests evolved in a system in which the fire was like a grazer, reducing the density. And when you got that kind of system, the trees don't evolve with resistance to stressors because they weren't at high enough density to compete. That's what the fire was doing. It's kind of coming in like a grazer or a reduction in the density of the stand to be able to build that resilience into the system, but it's highly dependent on keeping very low densities.
Although there is pretty good literature on comparable outcomes for redwood forests and coastal forests, because fire actually did occur relatively frequently. So that the frequent fire rainforest was one of the terms for them, for the asbestos rainforests. And their composition was also, like spruce has a very, very thin bark. So even a very light fire will reduce spruce composition. And so when you clear cut redwoods, you had massive seeding in spruce. And so areas that had been redwood dominated became spruce dominated. So much the same thing, and spruce don't have nearly that fire resilience, but also they have other pests, diseases. I think you can, even though Malcolm's not talking about the west side. I think that there's
No, I think
comparable
it's a good
literature
analogy.
for that as well. So density, spacing, and species as metrics.
Another question on this. So, when you talk about decreasing density, that's good, like thinking on a stand level, right? But if we're thinking like on a landscape scale, isn't it more like we want diversity of composition and densities and things in the face of an uncertain future?
Not quite. I agree with you. You want diversity, but one of the things we do want to keep in mind is that there are some species, particularly in the Sierra Nevadas, like the spotted owl, that depend on fairly high levels of canopy cover. And so what we're really trying to argue for here is matching how much biomass is on a particular site with the limiting resource. And the limiting resource in the Sierras and pretty much throughout all the West is water. And so what I'm trying to suggest is that you can create variable forest conditions. You can have some habitat over here for the spotted owl if you're keeping the big trees and the higher densities in wet places where there's a fair amount of water. And then over here, when you're on a southwest facing slope, and historically it used to burn frequently, and it's largely dominated by pine, you want very low density, very open set sand dunes. But you can have across the whole landscape, pretty much dovetailing into your point, you can create that diversity so that you have a range of conditions for a diverse range of wildlife habitat. But the thing that I think we've been missing is the recognition and varying the treatments and the forest conditions that we produce so that you have the higher density and the higher biomass in the wet places, and you have very open, low density conditions in the drier places. So I'm going to jump, I want to run into Anders. I'm going to jump into the second topic, which kind of builds off of this one I've just been talking about, which is this idea of carbon carrying capacity. And a woman named Heather Keith first proposed this in a paper back in 2009. And I've done a fair amount of research on carbon dynamics at a place called Tea Kettle Experimental Forest. And particularly with one of my old students, Matt Herta, we've written a series of papers. And I will shamelessly talk this one that just came out yesterday, but it talks about carbon carrying capacity in the Sierra Nevadas. And what the point of that research and what we're finding is that if you're looking just at carbon dynamics, you may focus too much on one aspect of that, and you would have current forests that are fire suppressed, and you'd say, wow, the carbon in those forests right now is as high as it used to be historically when there was just a few big trees, sometimes even a little bit higher. But the problem is that you destabilize the carbon in the system, particularly destabilize the big tree carbon, which is in carbon, one of the biggest things to think about is what are the stable structures, and size matters. The little trees that have all come in with fire suppression, they destabilize the pattern because they can trigger the drought, they can trigger the bark beetles coming in, and you could lose the large trees. But what you really want to do is be able to not get greedy, pull the carbon back, reduce it enough so that you're below the maximum amount that might be in there from holding fire out of the system. But you're going to channel, particularly if you remove the small trees, either with mechanical thinning or with fire, the growth, the carbon uptake, the accumulation is going to go into the big trees. And they are the gold, the muni bonds, they are the secure way of holding carbon in the system. And if you let the forest stand fill in with all these small trees, you're basically taking your carbon investment, and putting it in junk bonds because it's destabilizing the whole system. So it's a fairly simple concept, and we've done a lot of work trying to quantify that and see how it plays out. But that's basically the story. It's carbon dynamics in these forests are not very complicated. What you really want to do is open the stand up and get the growth, the uptake, the carbon that's getting pulled out of the atmosphere in these big old growth trees because they're the most stable structures in forests.
Malcolm, one of the points that I think is important for people to realize is that when you remove carbon from one of these very dense stands, that stand is going to reabsorb that carbon in a relatively short period of time. And this is one of the things we were reflecting in our recommendations about how you could integrate both the fuels management and the older, more naturally structured forests, that you will get back to that within 10 years in general. So there's a time issue here that, yes, you're going to be reducing that stand carbon, but then you're going to be reabsorbing it. So you have effectively a closed and more stable system then going forward, and as you reiterate that.
Yeah, it's a really good point because what's happening with that accretion of carbon is that to be able to get it to switch it over to the big trees, you're going to have to pay a carbon penalty up front. And that's taking some of the trees, thinning them out, either putting them in a biomass facility or whatever you might do with them. But then what happens is it opens up growing space and the trees take advantage of that growing space, pull carbon out of the atmosphere, but they end up in the big trees rather than the little junk bond ones that you've just taken out there. And at Tea Kettle, we compared different thinning techniques, and it's exactly this time period you're talking about. The shortest restocking of the trees was 7 years, and depending on how heavy the thinning was, you got up to about 15 years before you got back to the carbon level you were at before.
And that's in a relatively drier forest. In a wet forest, you can do that more quickly. Adam had a point, and then
Yeah, well, I just wanted to make it clear, because it's a common misconception. The state's objective is not to maximize carbon stocks or carbon sequestration in our forests or in any ecosystem. We want the same thing as everybody else: healthy, resilient ecosystems and communities. So in no way is the state supporting maximizing carbon at the cost of public safety or health or ecosystem services. So I just want to make sure that that's clear. Everyone's on the same page there. Also, but I just wanted to come back to this idea about, storing all of the carbon in large trees, because I guess this also gets to my idea of diversified carbon stocks. Just going back to your same analogy about investing, in an uncertain future, you gotta diversify your investments, right? And so, yes, given our current climate, maybe carbon is the most secure in large trees, but what happens if you remove all of your small trees, you have everything in big trees, your vapor pressure deficit goes up, and then you have hydraulic failure across massive amounts of large trees, because larger trees are more susceptible because of height with the hydraulic failure. So
Well, the flip side of it, though, is that bigger trees also have deeper root systems. And in the Sierras, we've done isotope work looking, actually pulling the water out of the tree and then comparing it to different depths that came out of the soil. And it varies tree to tree and individual, but generally the larger the tree, the deeper the water source it's drawing from. And so that's one of the things that really adds to the stability. Roger Bales has done a fair amount of work on this, showing that what happened in the 2012 to 16 drought was you eventually had such a long duration drought that you even depleted the deep water sources, which sometimes we're talking about 8 to 12 meters down, because it's fractured granitic bedrock. So there's a lot of water down there. Yeah. But it's very much what you're talking about. Is that you never entirely get out of threats. And I'm not saying, one size fits all, but I'm saying that probably by reducing the level of competition, and particularly the competition for water, you're probably going to give the forest a better chance of surviving some of these stressors, particularly with the big trees' ability to draw deep water. And that's where all the giant sequoia groves are, is they're down with their roots, their feet in the wet conditions.
a couple of other questions, gentlemen. And okay.
Yeah, and this falls in between Malcolm and Adam's points, is that I just wanted to caution when we say like that the older trees can recover that carbon in 10 to 15 years. We've shown a sensitivity of these older, particularly the Wind River stand that I worked on, just like the 450 to 500-year-old forest.
You're going to need to speak up.
Okay, I can do that. Working in the Pacific Northwest, we've shown sensitivity of an old growth forest to climate indices, and we've seen it being very, opportunistic in a way. That when we have an El Nino year and the cycles align, we have a nice wet year. We see carbon uptake on the level of the young stand. Like you couldn't tell it apart from like a 50 to 80 year plantation. But then when we have drought impacts because of the large carbon pools, the sensitivities are different and the vulnerabilities are there. So I just want to caution them when we say they can recover, the climate has to a degree cooperate, because if we do get the wrong climate cycles, we might not recover that carbon that we're taking out in the next 10 to 15 years. However, the forests have a much longer outlook that can grow another 500 or 1,000 years. And in that time, they will recover. I just don't want to, I want us to be cautious that it's not automatic and the conditions have to be correct for the trees to take it.
I think that's a very good point. And what some tree physiologists are calling it now is structural overshoot, which means that you have a few wet years, trees add on enough leaf area that they photosynthesize at a pretty rapid rate. And then when you get into a prolonged drought, they've got too much photosynthetic activity going on that then kind of crashes the system faster. So you're right about. I mean, there's no such thing as like one answer to fit all these conditions. But, yeah.
Yeah, this concept of thinning at first in the carbon loss, that's kind of at the core of the CAL FIRE's Forest Health Program. We have this loss and then this recouping. So I do all the modeling for the Forest Health programs. And we're taking out about 15 to 20%. And, it seems like we would like to get that true resilience. We need to take out a lot more. But even with that 15 to 20%, I'm noticing in the modeling in FES world that we don't recover it until 50 to 60 years, if even. And if you take out above 20%, sometimes you'll never recover that. So there's a little bit of a disconnect between the modeling world and this, like the literature that says 10 to 15 years recovery. And that's something that's kind of very much at the core of our carbon accounting.
Well, this would be a long digression, but FES, I've used it a lot, but it does have real limitations. It's very focused on that stem exclusionary phase that silviculture is really focused on to be able to correct stand development. It does not. It's really that effective. The regeneration model fails in all but one system. And the old growth, when you're taking trees past about 120, 150 years, it is not realistic in terms of what's going on there at all. And so it works very well from about age 10 to about age 100. And I think the FES results I get when I'm looking at that particular stage, it does very well. But once you start getting into big old trees, or you start trying to model the regeneration dynamics, what's going on?
Exactly. Yeah, I think the regeneration is always a challenge, is that getting that natural regeneration in the module, and that clearly would add a lot of the carbon recouping. Yeah. But that's not the big trees putting it in.
Regeneration is better than I guess. Yeah. So I'm just going to hit on one last point, because I don't want to stop the end. I don't want to take up too much time here.
We've got you till 2.
But Andrew's got some very interesting things to say.
Oh, but he's got till 3.
But I think the final piece that I would suggest that's really come out strongly in research in the last 10 to 15 years is infrequent fire forest systems, understanding the importance of the spatial arrangement of the forest. And at present, we have a bit of a disconnect going on between the stand conditions that silviculturalists are often producing and the stand conditions that we know are particularly resistant to fire as well as drought. And that pattern has been called by shorthand ICO it's a combination of individual trees, clumps of trees, and openings. And we're starting to get recently, just in the last year or two, understanding of the physics behind why that system, that particular pattern, has better resistance to fire. We don't know exactly why it has better resistance to drought, but it appears to have better resistance to drought as well. But I would just urge that when we start focusing on the ideal forest conditions we want to create, yes, we want to remove fuels. Yes, we want to really reduce the density, but we also want to nail and get the structure right, because the forests that have those ICO patterns do much, much better in fire conditions. And it's because fire is largely driven by surface fuels. It's the radiant convective heat as those fuels are combusted. And the openings that you're producing in that ICO pattern really damp the fire down. A lot of times the fire actually drops out of the tree crowns and gets back on the ground because there's not that much radiant convective heat in these gaps, and therefore there's not enough to hold the fire up in the upper-story crowns. And the final note I'll hit on with this, again, I defer to Kevin on this, but it's very important in terms of the way we reforest these systems, because right now, when we burn up the forest, usually what we're doing is we're planting what civiculturalists themselves call pines and lines. And so a typical reforestation is often trees, mostly pines, on a 12 by 12 foot spacing. And it may have been a concept that worked really well when we had lots of funds to go back in, thin the stand, correct it, bury the spatial structure with chainsaws in the future and so forth. But that's not the kind of budgets that we have these days to be able to work in forests, particularly with the wildfire sucking up most of the dollars. And so it behooves us to really be careful and think about producing that particularly resistant spatial structure at a young age in these stands. And frankly, I'm going to just get on my soapbox and say, we're screwing it up right now by continuing to plant pines and limes. We know better. I've been to places in Mediterranean in countries like Israel and Spain, where they're already taking these ideas and they're planting trees in clusters. They're planting them in wetter spots. They're paying attention to the microtopography in front of them and adapting the forest to it. And it's just my final plug, but I really feel like we're being very short-sighted and continuing to desperately hold on to this idea that this is the way we've always done it, and this is the way we need to continue to do it. Frankly, I think it's a big mistake. I'll be quiet.
So we have three metrics that have been recommended: density, spatial patterns, and species composition.
Yeah.
As ways of measuring resilience. Any other questions for Malcolm, or shall we move over to Andrew for the session?
I have one question. How do you verify the forest resilience? How do you verify the forest resilience?
How do we define the forest? Verify.
How do you measure the metrics?
No, I know how you can measure metrics. How do you verify you say, oh, this kind of forest has a very high resilience. How do you verify that?
Well, I think you have to go back to assessing some of the things we were just talking about. Is what are the fuel loads, particularly the surface and the ladder fuel loads? Do you have a relative stand density that puts the stand down in like below 35% or below? And do you have a species composition mix? You can use any one of the diversity metrics, Berger, Parker, other metrics to just quantify the relative diversity of species composition in the stand. But to my mind, they feed into the things you were just mentioning there, is we have measurements for all three of these things that we can employ to actually verify or quantify what the forest condition is like in there.
I guess John Woo is really saying like, okay, those are the metrics for the stand structure, but how do you verify the functional resilience that results from that stand structure?
Well, I mean, I can do it if you give me a lot of money and a lot of measurements to do it. But I think, civiculture has always used shorthand methods to be able to get at function. Function is very expensive to be able to measure and assess, and frankly, very difficult to do across the landscape. And so usually people are using surrogates, and my major professor and someone that Lori knows very well, Jerry Franklin, always suggested that ecologists and foresters often use structure as a surrogate to be able to assess much more complex functional processes that are going on. And I will confess that I often fall into that, because if I'm trying to measure everything like What are the water dynamic distributions within a stand? How fast are the nutrient cycling? What are the decomposition rates? All those things. I can measure those, but boy, it's expensive and slow and difficult to do. So I don't have any qualms about using structure.
So the other really simple way perhaps is to look at how those forests behave under fire. And that is actually something that Andrew is going to be talking a little bit more about. Fire impact. So with your permission, we'll switch over to our next speaker.
We do have two hands that have been waiting.
Oh, could I just respond to that question though, a little? Because I think one answer that I think the way we assess it is often also it's a little bit indirect, but it's now possible to really measure tree mortality at almost often the individual tree scale, or at least, using pretty fine satellite imagery. You can also, I'm sure you know this, but that's how we would do it, is we would say, okay, when it's hit with a drought, like from 2012 to 2015, what's the variation in the tree mortality that happens, and which trees are dying and why? Like, just so speaking to composition is one example of this. I think that one of the most interesting things for me as a researcher in the last 10 years was when we were able to fly drones over large areas and measure individual, map individual trees that were dying and the neighborhoods around those trees. What it turned out, I was actually surprised by, maybe, I shouldn't be because the principles all suggest it, but that it's a lot more risky. We were able to determine by just looking at the pattern of mortality that, it's a lot more risky to be a pine tree if you're growing in a neighborhood with a lot of other pine trees than if you're growing in a kind of diverse neighborhood where the hosts are kind of more diffuse or basically because if it's just pines, it's this lovely banquet for the park people. And so that, and then there's also a lot of work, as there's one of the most active areas of research has been mapping fire impacts by looking at anything from kind of large scale patterns of impacts down to individual tree level impacts. And then, it's not a controlled experiment. That's the big thing that we lack often. It's not being able to control this. But if we have large enough areas that are burned under different weather conditions, different topography, different species composition, different forest structure, it's often possible to either do a decent job of attributing, you can't prove causation necessarily, but you can suggest it pretty well, and you can assess whether, if we say this metric really does confer resilience, if we go out and look at where a fire burned the forest, where we have a high level of that metric, do we get resilience or not? So.
I know one of our questions online said he would wait, and so I don't see a second.
It's Christy.
Christy.
Christy?
Hello. Thanks, Malcolm. I have a question and then a couple comments. Malcolm, you didn't talk at all about assisted gene flow or the genetic composition. And I'm just, maybe one of the other speakers is going to address that, but I think that's a big potential issue for increasing, for sure, drought resistance. And some of the stuff that Patricia Maloney's done with trees on the landscape that survived the previous droughts and beetle infestations. So I guess that's a question, what do you think in terms of the role of gene flow in what we're planting? And then the couple just quick comments, just to say, I don't know what other people are doing, but we're planting in ICO patterns post-fire right now and have been. And then I also think there's potential to test whether reduction in amount of carbon on the land and also how much of it is in small trees versus big trees by looking at remotely sensed indicators of drought stress and seeing if those go down after a thinning treatment. So during the previous drought, there was a lot of work in remote sensing, which a lot of people in this room know better than me, looking at not just waiting until the trees are dead, but what are the indicators of drought stress in different stands that could lead to death if conditions weren't changed. And so if we're going to undertake these treatments, I think we want to invest more in understanding those indicators so we can see, did we actually reduce drought stress when we did these thinning treatments? And then just finally, I'm in Adam's camp over, I do think right now the limiter is drought and is likely to be in the future, but let's not put all our eggs in that basket because it could be fungus, a new insect, a new disease that maybe your most drought resistant trees are more susceptible to. So diversity, diversity, diversity.
Diversity and low density, because one of the things that does consistently come out is whether it's fungal pathogens or other stressors, trees just generally tend to have much higher survival rates if they have rapid growth. Vigorous growth rate is one of the ways that you escape that kind of what's been called the death spiral that trees go into. But your first point is right on about considering the genetic component. And there's, as you know, there's tests going on taking seeds from 500, sometimes even 1,000 feet lower in elevation and planting them up into new locations, thinking that those may be adapted to the way the climate is shifting. And those studies, I think, are really promising, interesting to see what comes out of them. I don't go the next step just as an ecologist and say, let's move species, because I think we run into all sorts of problems there. But I do think that there's a real potential benefit to trying to figure out which individuals actually are better genetically in terms of being able to deal with the climate stresses that are coming our way.
I think we have a good 100 to 200 years before we have nothing but big old trees on the landscape. So we have a little bit of time to assess our evolution here.
Don't underestimate humans' ability to change landscape.
Well, let's get a chance. Andrew.
Okay.
Because I don't see any other hands up, but maybe you guys do. Andrew, would you?
Sure, sounds great.
You had slides,
I
right?
do have some slides. I thought it would be fun to just look at a few pictures.
You just told me to next it.
Oh, yeah. So yeah, go ahead. And next slide, please. And then click down again. Thanks. Yeah. So, right. I was trying to assess, like what's actually useful to you to hear. So I don't want to go on too long because I think some of the things I'm saying are going to be old news to you. Maybe other things aren't, but I'm going to try and what I'm going to do is talk a little bit, try to split the difference here a little bit, and talking about a few big picture trends and mix that in with a little bit more in the weeds work that I've been involved in recently. And so that's a little bit biased towards just what I've happened to be working on. But it really kind of focused, what I'd like to try and do is, I think it's pretty interesting already to hear your questions and some of the discussion about, thinking about forests, thinking about their function, what do we really want, healthy forests, healthy communities, and there's always the carbon kind of side of that as well. So I'd like to talk a little about just what happens with wildfire, whether its impacts in a big, very broad sense currently, what's it kind of doing for us and not. Of course, with fire, like the big thing that happens in terms of emissions is that it converts those live stems, big stems and trees into dead stems, and then you get the decomposition, or if you turn it into building material, whatever happens to that, which is ultimately decomposition too, I guess, but I'm not an expert in that. And the other thing I'd like to talk a little about is what we know or how I'm thinking about. And I think how research is kind of going on, thinking about the impacts of fire, the resilience of fire afterwards. So if you get a pretty intense fire, as we're getting over large areas, how much uptake can you expect to see there? And are there particular, main drivers or rules that you could use to try and figure out which areas are going to kind of return relatively quickly to the rest or not? And then sort of over the longer term, as we I think it's kind of the shadow, we keep alluding to this, 50 years, 70 years, 100, 200 years. There's a lot of work, started to getting into modeling land there, which Lara is going to talk about, but you ultimately see there will be places, of course, that are going to transition from what they are now, the type of forest they are now, to something else, because it's getting warmer and there is a temperature threshold at which conifers of any size aren't going to persist. And so we'll get something else, but that something else is not nothing. It's other plants. It's probably oaks in a lot of places. But I want to kind of leave that to Laura. So if you could, well, let me just say, as we all know, right, like fire has really taken off, particularly in the forested parts of the state. I think one thing that shows up in this, if you just look at these fire perimeters over time, is if you look at Southern California, it hasn't changed all that much, right? Like there's plenty of big decades of fire in the past. What's really changed is in the central and northern parts of the state, both kind of the Mendocino and Trinity, western side, and then up into the northern central Sierras, right? That's where we've really seen this change. So we've gone from a state of very, very low fire occurrence, kind of like glacial, like if you look back over long periods of time and look at charcoals and sediments and things over longer periods of time, the amount of fire that we had 20th century was sort of at the glacial level, is because we were so good at suppressing fire. We just didn't have that for a long time. And that has sort of landed us where we are now. And now we're suddenly seeing this outbreak of fire that's actually burning very large, significant chunks of the forest. And it sort of appears as starting to fill, you can see even this year, filling in the gaps. Like we had the Dixie fire, we had North Complex, and now we had the Park fire this year, sort of filling in the gap. There's still some big gaps left, like the North Yuba watershed is not burned. It's gonna, right? So what happens when things burn? A lot of things. But next slide, if you could. One thing that I just want to highlight is, there's sort of, as we know, there's major impacts of these fires, a lot of carbon emissions. There are really big high severity areas that really concern foresters and all kinds of folks, people living in those areas. But there's also still, even under contemporary conditions, which is fuel loaded forests and really intense fire suppression that puts out almost all fires when they're burning under conditions that allow them to be put out. So the only fires that are escaping are these are fires under pretty extreme weather conditions usually. Even under that, okay, so that seems like a pretty stacked deck against good outcomes. It's still more than half the area that burns in these mega fires that is burning at low to moderate severity. That's kind of a term of art, I guess, moderate. But what I'm using it term to mean here is that there's substantial adult tree survival after the fire. Substantial meaning like 20% plus of the live trees are still alive, 15 to 20% after the fire. That threshold might vary depending on how you're using that term, but so low to moderate severity means there's actually quite a few trees left, quite a few seed sources left. So there's live trees still absorbing carbon, they are still making seeds, and so potentially you could get more seedlings coming in after the fire in those areas. And meanwhile, the fires are sort of cleaning up, reducing surface fumes, obviously. That's what they're actually mostly doing. You turn to the next slide. So yeah.
Ask you a quick question.
Yes.
So there's significant density reduction if you have 20% live trees.
Yeah.
And we want to get to under 35% in terms of stand density. I mean, these are two relative and different measurements, but how close is that getting to the kind of density that you actually think is going to be long-term viable?
Yeah, that's a great question. I haven't actually done that, like kind of mapped it. I'd really like to. That is something that we're working toward. But I would say, yeah, but in a lot of, I would say, in the sort of middle of the road, moderate severity fire is getting pretty close, probably to Malcolm, you would.
Yeah, there's several studies that found moderate severity ought to get you pretty, not all the way, but much closer to historic conditions and what was like.
I mean, it's not right. I just, here's just a slide of a couple of, just trying to illustrate that diversity of fire effects within the Caldor fire from 2021 that, we're familiar with because it's nearby. And it started right down near Grizzly Flat and burned that town up. And the first couple of days, it had this big run. Was really pushed, and this is mostly high severity. You kind of see in the background here, they're mostly dead trees, and then the rest of, there were a few weeks where it was sort of puttering along, making little runs, leaving a lot of live trees, and then had another run near the end that was able to be stopped luckily before it hit South Lake Tahoe and Meyer. But even, yeah, so within this one fire over several weeks, you had really a big diversity of impacts and behavior. Could you go to the next slide here? And yeah, so sort of trying to bring this all to like what is the point? The point I'm trying to kind of get to here is that these fires, as you probably heard, like are doing a lot of useful ecological work in terms of their effects on fuels and their effect on live tree density in a lot of, and more than, I mean, this is not surprising because these fires are huge. They're millions and millions of total acres. And, despite a lot of investment and hard work by the state to ramp up fuel treatments and to do more prescribed and controlled burning, we haven't gotten to that scale yet. And so the biggest single process that's reducing fuels in forests right now and treating them in that sense is wildfire. And that probably will continue to be the case for some time, because I don't expect that we'll see these, over the next decade, we'll see a lot more big fires. They will continue to burn a lot of their area in low to moderate severity. And, we'll be ramping up, we hope, right, with treatment rates, but it'll still be ahead of us. And so a lot of this area is being treated by fire. I think that's really important, not because that means like, okay, we don't have to do anything, but actually kind of the opposite. It actually sets the table for us to do more. Because if the wildfire's gone in and done a pretty good job on surface fuels and killed some trees that creates a bunch of dead wood, there's then a bunch of work that can be done in those areas that have burned already to kind of harden them against future fire. I've even heard, folks from CAL FIRE talk about with the Caldor fire, you could really in perpetuity manage the fuels in a lot of that fire perimeter just with controlled burning from now on, because they're not like that. It's not that we want it to burn. Like you wouldn't, like if I could go back and say, let's not set the Caldor fire off, I would say, yes, that's good. That's definitely the right thing. Because it killed, it's a very damaging fire to a lot of people. It emitted a lot of carbon. If you could control burn that same area under milder conditions, it would have been an even better outcome. I'm just saying that given that happened, there's actually some upsides, if that makes sense. Okay, so could you go to the next? So I'm kind of talking, like optimistically, this is, great. We're reducing fuels. That should reduce future fire severity because there's less fuels on the ground. So recently we did this study to look at across Western frequent fire forests, not just in California now, but across the West, but still sticking with this frequent fire area. Can you click down one more time and bring up the words on here? Cool. Do we see because there's so much more fire, there's a lot of areas where fires are now intersecting and burning over previous recent fires. And so we were able to find many hundreds of fires that have done this across the West recently at different times since the initial fire. So we're looking at scenarios where there was one fire, the frequent fire forest, and then within a couple of decades after that, a few decades after that, you have another fire burning the same area. And we tried to ask, do you see a discernible effect of the first fire reducing the severity of the second fire? And pretty clearly the answer was yes. Yeah, and it kind of has to, because fuel loading is such a powerful driver of fire behavior. You have less fuel, you will have less intense fire behavior, all things being equal. And we really did find this. So like if this I don't know how useful these little spaghetti plots are, but basically the x-axis we have time between fires. So between that first fire and the reburn, and this is the reburn severity on a kind of scale that represents high severity up here above the top of the chart and low severity down here. You kind of get this reduction in severity over at least the first decade. It's pretty pronounced across the whole West. In some places, this effect only lasts a little more than 10 years, we found. In other places, it's more like 20, but it does buy you that. Yeah.
Did you control it all for salvage operations? Because I would think like the dead trees in the moderate severity fire, they're dropping their branches over those years as well, creating fuel load.
That's a great question. Yeah, we actually were really interested in looking at the effects of management in between the two fires. But when we looked at this scale across hundreds of fires, large areas, the amount of management was actually pretty small. We really only could get a few % of the area had been managed, so we weren't able to look at it.
Okay.
But I think you could, like, I think if you zeroed in on those areas more precisely,
Mhm.
you probably, that would be a cool study.
Is there a correlation between, I'm sorry, I'm gonna, for members of the committee, I'm gonna call on them first if you don't mind something. But, are you seeing this interaction also aligned with the historic fire interval?
These, great question. We pretty much constrained the forest that we looked at as just being forests that historically burned at under, at least every 30 years, so 10, 20, up to 30. So we don't really, and within that, we didn't map what we think, what the historical record is for fire info. So they're all frequent.
It sounds somewhat correlated, but we have a question from Matt and we have a question from Mario.
Yeah, I'll try to be quick. This is Matt, California Environmental Justice Coalition. Some of our communities are dealing with the threats of sort of salvage, since you brought it up, salvage wood pellet operations that are planning to pull out, 1 million metric tons per year out of Lassen and Tuolumne National Forest. And it seems that there's, for every reduction in the cellulose, the biomass fuel load, there's sure a lot of disturbance of the forest floor and guttering up that floor, dragging out bollwood, because these wood pellets, they aren't made out of slag. They're not made out of, leaves and twigs and needles. They're hauling out the biggest trees they can, and they convert that bollwood to wood pellets. And so I'm wondering if there's any sort of cost benefit analysis that's been done about reduction of fuel load, taking into consideration the disturbance of the forest floor and the water retention capacity in there. Because it looks really disastrous for these communities.
Do you have any?
Well, so that's not really I'm sorry, that's not really I don't know a whole lot more of that. I've just read papers, so anyone
Understood.
here knows more. I can say, yes, there have been some studies on salvage effects on fuel loads, and how long those effects last. And I think, as you'd expect, they reduce the very large fuels because they're taking out the trunks of the trees. So you have a big reduction in that form of fuel, but they tend to increase all the smaller. Generalizing a lot here, but the total amount of wood is at least as high after salvage. Usually, initially, it's higher, right? That's probably maybe part of what you're talking about. And then some of that decomposes, and then you've avoided some of the large trunks falling over later because you removed them. But it's not a dramatically different effect on woody fuel from papers that I've read.
Okay, we were directed to some studies, which I'm not qualified to evaluate, man, but about parts of the Dixie Fire that had experienced sort of, let's say, less than meticulous thinning, and that those parts burned hotter and caused more permanent damage to the soil below. So I assume that ties in here somewhere, but I understand if it's not your area of research.
Mario?
Yeah, hi, thank you, Andrew. This is super interesting. I have a clarifying question, I think, on the graphic that we're looking at right now. And I'm sure you said it and I probably didn't hear it, but how did you, so on your spaghetti plots there, how are that average, I guess, or those moderating effects determined? So the 12 years for the Western Mountains and then the rest of them about 20 years. Is that kind of like an average, or how did you develop or get to that number for these plots here?
Yeah. Oh, thanks for that question. Yeah, because we actually thought a lot about this, like how do you determine how long this effect lasts? And we basically were the way we answered that question, and I think there are other ways to do it, but was just to look at where that line, the slope of that line, gets close to zero, so that if you take into account the uncertainty bands around the slope, it's basically hitting zero.
Okay.
We look, how long does it take? How many years does it take? We went in with the assumption, and it turned out to be true, that it would be sloping upwards initially, and then we wanted to ask, okay, when does it stop sloping upwards?
Okay.
And that's what as the time.
So got it. So it's just based on your rate. Okay. And then my other okay, super. Thank you. I just wanted to get that clear in my head. Really neat analysis. And then I had one more kind of, I guess, comment on your previous slide. I think the statistics that you showed about, you know, from between 2010 and 2020, over 1.4 million acres burned at low to moderate severity, and that's 3 times more area than active treatment with mechanical thinning. I just wanted to point out, I think that's a really like a positive way to look at like a negative thing, if you will. You know, these fires are occurring, but they're really helping us sort of get to a point where we could maybe start looking at, you know, what amount of low to moderate severity is out there, and as a result of these fires that are otherwise, you know, really impacting our communities in a way that we don't want to. So I really appreciate that point, Andrew, and kind of the sort of comprehensive way that you're looking at fire on the landscape. So thank you. Thanks for the chance to comment.
Thanks, Mario.
Did you have a question this week?
Yeah, and it might be another slide along this, but can you comment, or does your research touch on the flip side of that, the extent to which high severity begets more high severity, and the extent to which those patches expand across landscapes? And
Yes.
what that looks like.
Yeah, this is great. So like Marianne was talking about, like trying to get a comprehensive view of things, and that I'm glad you brought that up, because if you really want to look at the whole view, it's also true that when you have a reburn, if you look at the total area affected by high severity fire, you know, the first fire has some patches of high severity. The second fire can't kind of like undo that. It's always going to nibble out more and create more high severity area. So if you have a bunch of successive wildfires burning under pretty extreme conditions, so that some of them are burning, some of the areas burning at high severity, you will tend to enlarge those patches of high severity as you have more fire. So that is the downside. And I think one of the things that's a big open question, and something I'm really curious about, is can you avoid that? If you were to burn these sort of intentionally, either if you controlled burning or possibly manage wildfire, if it's an area that's reasonable to think about doing under kind of relatively moderate weather conditions, perhaps you can actually avoid enlarging those. So this makes sense. You know, think about like these high severity patches. There's been some really interesting, I think Brian Harvey at University of Washington has done some interesting papers on this, just illustrating how those patches increase in size, and Monica Turner too, after reburns. I think it's really important. Yeah, it's an unknown, I think, to figure out what can you introduce fire in a way, reintroduce fire in a way to a burned area, previously burned area, that doesn't, or you know, that minimizes the expansion of the high severity areas. And I guess the only way you could do that is doing it under relatively mild weather conditions. Potentially, there might be some fuel pre-treatment that you'd want to do. I think a big question is, like, there's often a big explosion of shrub regrowth after those initial fires. That I think maybe this is part of what you're suggesting, is there can be a positive feedback where you have more fine fuels because of the first high severity fire. You get the shrubs growing up, and if it's dry enough that they are flammable, or even quite flammable, then they can increase the severity of the fire. So potentially, would it make sense to do some pre-treatment of those fuels before introducing fire again? I really don't know. I think that's a really important, interesting area of research. But, yeah.
Sorry, could you just clarify? I think maybe you were starting to touch on it, but the sort of the dynamics underpinning that pattern. I guess I don't totally understand why the perimeter would be expanding when you have additional.
Yes, great. So the reason why is because if you, and I don't have a great picture to show of this, but actually maybe if you, could you flip to the next slide? I'm not sure if that's the one that might have this, have something relevant on it. Sorry, I forget the order here. Yes. Okay. So let's say here's part of the Caldor fire again. And the lighter areas are surviving trees. So this is one burn. And you can see there's actually some like ribbons of surviving trees in here. If you had another fire come through, this is not actually happening. So this is just, imagining counterfactually, like 5 years from now, there could be another fire that might be able to get started in here, and there might be enough fuel for it to carry. What would happen is, if you look at the severity pattern, all the live trees left over here, That next fire is within that short interval, there won't be enough new trees growing up to sort of fill in this high severity gap. And the second fire is going to kill at least a few of those surviving trees from the first fire. There's kind of this one-way ratchet of, not necessarily, because the second fire, if it's very mild, could allow a bunch of seedlings in here to survive, even small seedlings, because it'll just miss them or it's patchy, so that it wouldn't interrupt. So there's like two things it could do. One is just like actually reinforce this high severity area by killing any seedlings in it and eat away at the surviving trees. That's the concern. That's a pattern like Brian Harvey's papers have shown. And so, yeah, the challenge then is like, is there a way to allow fire back in here that won't have that effect, or like minimize that effect? Basically reduce the fuels without killing all the regenerating trees. Malcolm's done some work on this. He's not here to talk about. Pyrosilviculture is one term that he's coined for that.
So from a metrics perspective, there are a couple of questions here.
Yeah.
One is in terms of resilience, what this imagery is showing us is that it raises the question of, are biological legacies a measure of resilience? So the presence or absence and the quantity of biological legacies as a measure of resilience within a fire landscape. And at what, at the 10-meter resolution, you get quite a bit better information. I think you all there's some agreement around with NASA about high resolution imagery. And at what resolution is that?
Well, that'll be at 1 to 2.
So the ability to measure the presence or absence of biological legacies, or the elements of what would be a biolab, should be substantially improved.
Yeah.
Would you think that assessing the number and extent and condition of biological legacies would be a good metric for resilience?
Yes. Yeah. I mean, one of the things that's really the big, I'm guessing is the biggest, I think it is the biggest lever kind of on resilience is how many seeds are being produced in an area. Well, there's two things. Okay, there's the surviving trees themselves. So those light areas, those little ribbons and patches. Or, over here you can see there's an image of, surviving trees, patches of them. They're actually sequestering carbon, they're growing, they're still forest. And they're also producing, hundreds to thousands, tens of thousands of seeds per year each. It's the difference between an area in this particular kind of forest that is in the middle of one of these high severity patches and is next to one of these little ribbons, surviving anywhere in the sort of area near those, it's going to be getting seed ready. So at least potentially you could have relatively quick regeneration of trees. There are other things that could impede that, obviously, like really harsh conditions without the rest of the forest cover there. Although, having surviving trees also would provide a bit of shade, may be helpful. Yeah.
Have you looked at soil destruction in the high severity fires, because that can hinder regeneration?
That's a great question. Yes, no. I totally should though, because it does, right. Fire does use up carbon, right. It burns some of the carbon up in the soil. It emits some of the nitrogen. I think I'm just saying things. Well, I'll probably know, but like remove some of the nitrogen from the system. It kills some of the mycorrhizal fungi that the tree, particularly pine trees, rely on, these ectomycorrhizal fungi. The reason why I so far kind of am optimistic about that is even in areas that are really intensely burnt, such as areas that have been under a log, like an old rotten log that completely combusted during the fire and kind of sterilized the soil under it. Those are great seed beds for pine trees. I at least anecdotally, walking around, you see often like lines of pine seedlings in those very areas. Of course, that wouldn't be true if you had this over a large area, that kind of soil impact over large areas, followed by erosion that stripped away, the seeds and the topsoil. Then you wouldn't get regeneration there. So you could have, they could go both ways. I don't think we know very well.
I guess one question really is, back to ARB is at what level of resolution are you getting your data from to assess emissions from fires? And how are you characterizing those in annual emissions? Because if you're getting it, and CAL FIRE's mapping tends to be a little bit grosser in scale of fire intensity. So one recommendation might be to align the state in terms of the grain of the resolution size of the imagery, and to align the emissions with what that imagery at a finer scale, whether, as Matt pointing out, there's even something finer, but with NASA imagery, you should have it for the whole state, right?
Well, yeah, so yeah, aligning fire perimeters is easier said than done. There's lots of streams of information coming on that, and yeah, we're working also with other groups at CARB and CAL FIRE to understand, yeah, like what's going on with fire, and then quantifying the carbon out of that. And that's many different resolutions. I mean, some of it doesn't necessarily have a resolution, some of it's a vector, so that's not really a resolution, it doesn't have that.
Right.
Anyway, yeah.
Well, we'll let you continue. I want to
Okay.
come back to the question of the impact of salvage versus fire and low and moderate in particular, but please, you have some more fascinating.
All right, I'll say a few more things about like biological legacies, I guess, if you could. Oh wait, there's one more thing. Okay, so when you see the traditional severity maps, which I think sounds like agencies are moving beyond to some extent, are often.
Did you see the hand gesture?
Oh, yeah. Okay, so the limitations of, like, if you go to the MTBS, which is a great program, it's like very valuable, but monitoring trends in burn severity, it's actually really important to map those and provide them to people. You can just load severity maps for any fire, do any kind of analysis you want on it, just look at where your house is compared to that or whatever. There are some downsides to it, which I think we've already kind of alluded to, but one is they're historically based on 30 by 30 meter roughly squares of that imagery. So that's a bit coarser than an individual tree, obviously, or even a couple of trees. The other is that they're deliberately set at a threshold, like when you look at the red on those, which is usually the conventional color for high severity, whatever color that is, it's usually set at a threshold that corresponds to around 10 to 20, but often 15 or 10% tree survival. So in terms of, severity, yeah, sure, that's a high severity impact if you have 91% of the trees killed. If you have 91% of the trees killed, you still may have dozens of live trees per hectare, which is a lot if you're talking about seed availability. So, so they're really, the metric does some things really well, but it doesn't, I think, doesn't really characterize resilience or allow you to characterize resilience terribly well. So there's a lot of work, including some that I've done myself, where we kind of simplify and say, well, if you're in the middle of a high severity patch on one of those maps, you're not getting seed, it's not coming back as forest. And that's not necessarily true, because you just crank up the resolution to like 10 meters like we did here, where now is, that's already kind of superseded by this 1 to 2 meter imagery that you can get every year, every location, anywhere. We can now do this very precisely. So looking at surviving live tree biomass or density, be really easy to do that. And I think that would be really useful in terms of thinking about the future trajectory of the forest. Okay, next slide, please. I just have one more thing that I just wanted to bring up. Because, and I really have to tell you, I don't know how important this really is yet. We've also been with a lot of support from CAL FIRE, thank you, to do this. Been actually asking this question of, even though we generally assume, managers generally assume there's no seed being in areas where all the adult trees are killed, because these trees don't. So this isn't like, I don't know if you've read any of Monica Turner's classic papers about the Yellowstone fires and how resilient that forest was to high severity fire. Those are trees that have aerial seed banks stored up over years that are ready to be released when a fire happens. That's not the case here. They release all their seeds more or less every year. So there's no big seed bank stored. But there are cones in the trees each year. And if a fire burns when the cones are in the trees and the seeds are ripe, there actually are seeds. So that's another biological legacy that exists. and sometimes can produce a bunch of seedlings. And so we've been doing some research looking at that. So even in the areas where all the adult trees are killed, it may not be safe. I mean, it may actually be, useful and kind of predictable to know whether or not there would be seeds present and whether there'd be seedlings present. And so we've already, for years seen like lots of anecdotes about this. You can go to the middle of some fire or the king fire, whatever, and you find, oh yeah, look at these sugar pine seedlings. They must have come from that bed. But is that important at a big scale? So could you flick to the next slide? Here's and one more down. We went to several of the big recent fires from 2020 and 2021 to kind of ask this question. And we found in areas that are right in the middle of a really big high severity patch, sometimes you see no seeds. After a lot of the 2020 fires, we saw very few seedlings, tree seedlings coming up. This is just illustrating, it's anecdotal, but illustrative. Here's the Caldor fire epic. So sometimes you did. And the thing that seems to make the difference is, number one, when the fire happened. Did it happen when the seeds are still in the cone and ripe? And two, was it a really brutal drought year the next year? I don't have statistical analysis to back this up because this is just like 1 year and the next year. This is a super dry summer in 2021, and we just really had trouble finding seedlings anywhere in the state that year. Whereas coming back the next year, it was kind of stunning. Like we thought we maybe have to look hard for this, but no. In both this and lots of parts of the Dixie fire, there's carpets and seedlings in the middle of the highest severity areas. Does that matter? You go to the next slide. Does that matter? We don't know. It may be that those seedlings failed for some other reason, such as, here's one of these sites. We just carved out this, like, we snipped all the shrubs, see if it would make a difference to the seedling growth and survival at this site, a couple of sites. But yeah, you can imagine a seedling growing in competition with those might have a hard time. So possibly it doesn't matter. The presence of millions and millions of seeds, maybe that doesn't matter. So I think that's another really interesting question that we'll find out the answer to it in a few years. We'll see what happens with these patches, but I'm really curious to find out. And if they do or don't make it, I think that'll teach us a lot about forest resilience going forward in other high severity events that are bound to happen. So that was it.
What is the JFSP planting project?
Oh, sorry, why did I put that there? That's shorthand to myself. There's this Joint Fire Science Program, which is a federal research funding program. We've gotten some funding from, involves the Forest Service and BLM and maybe some other agency that I'm not remembering. And they pool their money and they use it to ask particular management focused questions. So we did some research on survival of planted seedlings, and we found that shrubs, a really high density of shrubs around a planted seedling tended to make it grow or less likely to survive because of the competition. Yeah.
Have you done any mapping or anything to see like how common this is?
Yeah, we have our sites that are scattered throughout 4 of the really big fires in 2020 and 6 of the big fires in 2020 and 2021. So we have those maps, but it's actually, you can't see these with remote sensing. So we're exploring how well you could do it with drones. I think what you really have to do is actually go back to older burn areas, and we're actually launching a project to try and, there just wasn't a lot of fire, more than 15 years ago. So finding high severity patches that are 30 or 50 years old is really, there just aren't a lot. So it's hard to do this research. And the weather was different then. It's actually, significantly hotter now. I think we kind of have to, I guess, once the trees from these get big enough, in 10 years, we'll be able to do remote sensing, maybe sooner, and answer that question.
So there are a couple of comments from Christy, just kind of about the variability here, that sometimes shrubs can be in competition, but for example, if you have nitrogen fixing shrubs, they might be actually rather helpful. And also there's a question of time or succession. We tend to want a forest right back, but it may take time for that forest to come back and assume some different steps. So
yeah,
layering those two suites of expectations on things. Are there other questions on, online before we move to Amy? Or here in the room?
I don't know if this is, you're the right person for this question, but I'm just curious about, this is something I don't really hear about is, in terms of how these patches evolve as they're regrowing. Is there any research on how intensity or type of herbivory might influence that? Because it seems like some of these patches maybe are at risk of getting caught in this cycle of like really dense regrowth that turns back into really intense fire and just cycling through that.
Yeah, no,
This is a might change the trajectory.
thanks for that question. Yeah, well, I think that, right, in that picture, for example, like what's the survival, what's the lifetime, right now they're doing great, but those shrubs aren't gonna live more than a few decades. And what will happen to them and how soon will they be open? And the answer is, there's so much food there that it's a good question. I think that deer browsing pressure or elk browsing pressure isn't enough to really probably make a big dent in this, but I don't know that for sure. There are also a lot of, like lepidopterans that are eating the leaves of these and laying eggs on them. You can see actually causing a fair amount of light to get through that canopy by the end of the summer, because a lot of the leaves have fallen off. So that could be important. There's been some interesting work, like one place that you could do this investigation is Yosemite, because they've been having fire reintroduced there since the early 70s. And there's some high severity patches that are that old there. And people have gone to that. Some people from Scott Stevens' lab have been working there. I've gone there and just like tromped around myself. And you do find sometimes gaps. Either there's gaps initially, the shrubs just didn't germinate in a certain spot. It looks like a field of shrubs, but there are gaps in it, and the trees are growing there. And other places where the shrubs are dying back. Yeah, sorry, this is a long-winded, like very specific answer. Another thing that can happen is they can be damaged by cold. If there isn't a back and it gets really cold at night, it seems like the shrubs can get hit by that. Problem with these, all of those kind of dynamics in a really big high severity patch is that there's no seeds of trees. So if there's this upside potentially of like the seeds surviving the fire, that's just the year right after the fire, the seeds are available. They aren't going to come back the next year and the next year and the next. So if holes open up in that shrub canopy later, there are very few tree seeds to take advantage of that. So that probably would be a situation where if you want forest more quickly, you'd actually want to bring seedlings in. I mean, normally people would, foresters would like grow the shrubs or herbicide them in trees. But you could also, yeah.
But we might want to make a distinction here between forests and trees. But
sure,
trees are a component of forests, but they're not the only component. But there's a question from Matt, and I do want us to return to this question that was posed earlier, and I think it was your question, Matt, about the impact of salvage versus non-salvage within, in particular, low and moderate intensity burns. And what do we know about the impacts in terms of soil mycorrhiza, regeneration, carbon biodiversity, to the degree that we know that?
Yep.
Supposed to ask you to come back to that and ask Matt to come up with his question because his hand's up.
Yeah, I think, thanks, Lori. I would like an answer to that question because it's a real urgent and practical concern for some of these communities. We all know dragging a big tree through the forest floor and leaving a lifeless gutter is not good for that forest. And that seems to be part of some entities in California's idea of forest resilience. So I appreciate the nuance and the specificity that we're hearing here. And I think unfortunately it sort of plays poorly in Sacramento, where I'm going to a meeting in about an hour where we're trying to fend off giving unfettered access to dollars and resources and privilege to engineered carbon removal systems. I think we all agree here that we're seeing an avenue of investment that's worthy for California communities and places. So if anybody can make it to the joint meeting this afternoon of the Air Resources Board, who authorized this committee, who helped create this committee to provide meaningful carbon targets, I'd love to see you there. I think investing in people and places is always a good idea. I really appreciate the scientific specificity here, but turns out you don't really need that, because over there we're just lending credulity to desk engineers and engineered carbon removal solutions that don't require any of the sincerity and testing of your hypotheses over there. So I know that this is a statutorily required body to inform that California scoping plan, and I'm still waiting to see what the instrument is for the board to observe this meaningful work over here in 1757, and how the board is integrating that into their carbon targets, because we're still sort of fantasizing about the need for engineered solutions. So that was sort of my sign off. And then, of course, thank you in the absence of comprehensive policy solutions. We have rogue entities within the state of California that think cutting down trees and shipping them to Japan is how we make our forests safe. So thank you for that. And I'll be listening offline as I transit to that meeting. Thank you.
Thanks. Thank you, Matt. So we might want to come back to this salvage question. Amy, did you have a presentation you could share with us or discussion to lay out from us?
Sure. I think you had slated Lara to talk about modeling, and so I want to make sure that she's got adequate time, and there's a lot of overlap between her work and my work, so we'll leave the majority of that for her. I guess I just want to take a couple minutes from my time, or just take my time and only use a couple minutes to just emphasize the points that Christy, Malcolm, and Andrew were making, particularly with respect to the importance of diversity. So in the project that I'm on with Malcolm and Andrew currently, that's funded through the Moore Foundation, we're looking at how, what are the drivers of severity within wildfire, and with a particular focus on dry conifer forests. I also can't tell if I'm a disembodied voice still. Am I?
We're hearing you and we're seeing you.
Okay, all right. Oh, you do
Your
see
face
this.
is- Yeah.
Okay. Hey, hi, everyone. So a key takeaway of that work is that that more heterogeneity is connected with lower fire severity, which is probably not very surprising, but that heterogeneity includes spatial distribution and the species distribution of the vegetation, as well as variation in the landform. And so you all know there's not a ton you can do about variation in landform. That's you're not going to be able to just like make a mountain out of nowhere, but or maybe you can. If you can, that's great. It's amazing. But the thing that you have the most control over, as Malcolm was saying, is that the way that management is approached in terms of what you're planting and how and where. And so I think that it's a really interesting time, and I'm pretty excited to be doing this work right now because I work as a mathematician and modeler for the National Center of Atmospheric Research, and there's just so much data available right now, many more platforms becoming available, as Matt pointed out in the chat. And we just have a lot more data at our fingertips to use to address these problems. And so my work has focused on modeling and mapping vegetation characteristics across wide spaces. And it's just amazing to me now how much information we can get out of that remotely sensed data and how applicable they are to wildfire challenges. So yeah, I think I think what I would say is probably going to be redundant between Malcolm, Andrew, and Lara. So I'll just leave it there. And if anyone has questions, or if there's anything, a data challenge that you're facing, please don't hesitate to reach out. And I would love to, I probably, or maybe will or will not have an answer for you, but I like to talk about it and keep up with where people are at in their work. So if there's anything I can do to help you source data or talk about modeling, just please don't hesitate to reach out.
I'm going to suggest that we'll have a question, but we're going to take a break after these speakers and then come back to Laurel so that we've all had a chance to stand up, refresh our circulatory systems, and put a little more oxygen back in our brains. It's a great room to have, but it's not the most life-filled room in which to be. So are there other questions? I know I have one to come back to, but other folks have questions. And then Paula, did you want to?
Just a quick question, maybe. Is there any talk of coupling atmospheric models with fire models?
Oh, we have one of those at MCAR. Yeah, we should talk about that. So we've been working on the weather research and forecasting model coupled with the Rothermel implementation for maybe a decade now within our group. And so it's actually being implemented into the unified forecast system at NOAA right now. And so we've done a bunch of work with that to progress, that coupling, and especially a two-way feedback between the atmosphere and fire behavior. So it's we've done a lot of testing on it recently for that UFS implementation, and it's looking pretty good. I gotta say, it's there's a lot of excited and invested people working on that model. So I'm happy to talk about that if it's something that you guys are interested in looking at. Yeah.
This is a question to Amy and then maybe to Andrew. As we get NAEP imagery for the entire state, and we're looking at 1 meter resolution wall to wall. What is the what do you see the role and the necessity of field-based monitoring, moving forward? Plot-based monitoring moving forward, especially with your in your role. I'm curious.
Do you want me to answer, Andrew? Just for me, I'll give my specific answer, and that's I love NAEP data. I think that's awesome that we have that at our fingertips because it's really cost-effective way to get fine resolution data rather than having to source it from somebody like Maxar or Planet, right? Which are also really great sources, but they come with a cost. So NAEP data, awesome. I wish it were a little bit more frequent because I think that's one of the limitations. We can't really, it's it's one window at a time for a few years. And I don't know if you're implying that it's going to happen more frequently or if you're about to get a release for your state, but I don't know that the frequency of it is going to be helpful for looking at anything that's seasonal or monthly or anything daily, certainly. But I think that can help with modeling in general to give you a fine scale resolution data that you can then use to downscale or scale down the regularly available data. So you can definitely use it to inform what you're seeing in other data sets, especially something that's closer like Sentinel-1 or Sentinel-2, which I think you're going to talk about. I think it is really, really helpful for looking at that. So, or at least modeling it and trying to get a better sense of what's on the ground at a finer scale. I don't know if that helped you.
Can I rephrase the question just quickly?
Yeah, of course.
So as our remote sensing technologies improve, what is the role of on the ground plot-based data in your mind?
On the ground, like you mean field collections?
Like BBHK.
Yeah. One, I think it gives a psychological reprieve to being at a computer all day. That's a good one.
Spiritual value.
I think it keeps us connected to nature, which is really important, right? Like that's my honest answer there, coming from somebody who has to work in their office. But I think it is incredibly important that we see what's on the ground, that we really are connected to it, and that's we're not separate from it. That's super important. And then the Matt in the chat is, yeah. I will definitely connect with Matt. That sounds good. And the rest of you, if possible. That is my honest answer, is that we do actually need to stay connected to nature because it is a part of us and we are a part of it and we influence it. And you have to get outside sometimes outside of the fluorescent lights. But in terms of managing, I still think that regardless of what we're able to glean from remotely sensed data, our intuition, our connection is still going to tell us a lot. And I'll leave it there. I think you get the sense of what I mean.
I hate to. All right, I'm gonna try to keep it short because we need to break. Amy, that was amazing. Thanks for saying what's actually true. Two things that I would say, like, one is, I think it's actually, like, at some point we will stop needing validation for some things. Like, you can tell if a tree is dead. Pretty, you know, I mean, okay, there's still like, okay, there's a few green beetles, maybe you can't see that, but pretty, I think you can actually count the mapped in trees better. Maybe you can get the size, maybe, you know, better. There's some sky true thing instead of ground true. But there's so many things you can't see still, and I think will continue to be. So like from a population dynamics perspective, like there are whole major parts of the life cycle of the tree. I'm not saying anything you don't know that you can't see from above or probably remotely in the foreseeable future. So anything having to do with those life cycle transitions from settings, you know, flowering, setting seed, seed dispersing, seedlings coming up, seedlings surviving, that's invisible. And then understory processes like surface fuels. You can predict them probably pretty well with models, but you do need to validate them. Yeah, Christy, I agree. And then sort of from an ecosystem model perspective, there are all kinds of things that we just don't know that are really crucial to those models that can't be measured remotely, like photosynthetic parameters of plants and like their hydraulic failure points, so how dry does it have to be where they die. Even decomposition rates is really, really important, but you can't. I don't know. I haven't thought of a way that maybe there is remote sensors, but I don't think so. I think you still have. So yeah, I think there's still a lot of really important. So having a network of monitoring plots across whatever gradients of variability, they're really important and well represented in your study, in your like your focal area. I think it's going to remain crucial. I think your job is secure. I hope it's secure.
Yeah, and we probably want to make a real distinction here again about forest resilience as opposed to the ongoing supply of certain kinds of commodities and certain DBH funds. Because like one of the measures of resilience that probably we should be thinking about, but you could not get from remote sensing, is mycorrhizal health. Because it is so determinative in a tree's resilience to pests and diseases, uptake of water and nutrition. But you're not going to get that from remote sensing. You might see the impact of it, and then you validate it by measuring what the mycorrhizal health is, but you wouldn't get it from remote sensing data. So the linkage of these things is possibly a really important element in terms of that larger question of what is resilience, which was one of the questions that Adam had posed about, you know, what are the metrics that we want to have here as we're looking forward towards our broader climate goals in addition to our carbon goals. And while the carbon may be in the bowl of the tree, the resilience metrics is going to be broader. So yeah, you're safe.
I would even go so far as to say, yeah, remote sensing makes it more important to us because you want to learn something like, yeah, maybe actually mycorrhizal fungi influence the way a tree looks. If you have a hyperspectral imager looking at it, you wouldn't possibly know that unless you have the plots where you have the data. So, you know what I mean? Like, you can learn what you can learn from remote sensing if you have the plot network. Otherwise, you just have some like photos.
Amy is Amy.
Yeah, I just have one more thing to add there that Andrew's reminding me of. So just to say that remotely sensed, like the eyeballs of remote sensing are so different than human eyeballs, right? So the sensors see so differently than a human does. And so there's information that's coming out of those platforms that we don't translate to what we see or experience on the ground. But it's just different, right? And so I don't think that they're not, humans and the sensors are not really very much in competition. They're just, we can go into that space being collaborative and complementary, I think, rather than, because I guess my key point here is just that the sensors do not have the same eyeballs that we do. They do not see the environment the same way. So there's just a lot of information there between our eyeballs and the sensor data. Too far, maybe too far.
Christy says, I agree. Right. Well,
Laura, trying to read instruction.
did you have a?
Well, I guess are we about to break?
We're about to break.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention, Amy, that I am not going to be talking at all about any remote sensing platforms or technologies. And so I don't know if you had prepared something that you wanted to say and were worried about the overlapping. And if so, I wouldn't fear that. I was going to focus more on sort of forest dynamics models.
Cool.
So anyway, just to say that if when we come back, there are some things that we could talk during the break if you like to see if there's something that you wanted to say that isn't going to come up in what I was prepared.
Perfect. Thank you.
Well, with that, why don't we have our 10-minute break and come back after that. Coming back more or less right on time. And Laura, would you like to move to center stage here?
Yeah, I can. You were just.
Yeah. Maybe why don't you sit right next to Andrew? Spot right there.
Oh yeah.
That works. You want that?
Yeah. No. Okay. Right.
Okay, so I was asked to give an overview of modeling, of forest modeling, and to talk a bit about strengths and weaknesses and types of questions that models are used for and best practices in modeling, and sort of there were a lot of different things packed into the ask. And so I put together a presentation I think is maybe a bit too comprehensive, but we have time. Yeah, so well, I should say it's a bit too comprehensive on the one hand. On the other hand, for folks who are really enmeshed in this, it's not very detailed. So it's sort of the worst of both worlds. But we'll see how it goes. Okay. So of course, there are many different reasons that people build and use computational models of forests. And here we're talking about modeling that can influence management, economic and policy decisions. And then decisions can have knock-on effects for cultural values, biodiversity, and so on and so forth. So while I'm going to talk about technical aspects of forest models, I've tried to keep in mind the larger context to emphasize the pieces that are most relevant. So in terms of what kind of my understanding, well, let me just start with a quick outline. So what I'm going to try and do is talk really briefly, give my best understanding of the objectives for forest modeling that happens sort of in the state, the types of forest models, give some overview there, as well as some assessment. I'm sure you all have other types of assessments that you could volunteer as well. I'll talk super briefly about wildfire processes and how these connect in with forest models, and even more briefly about forest management processes. And I'll say a little bit about requirements, some ways of thinking about how to select a model for a particular problem, a bit about uncertainty and best practices. Okay, moving along. So my understanding, I would say, of the objectives that I think the state has for forest modeling includes, obviously setting targets for forest carbon stocks, emissions, and sequestration rates. And then also, as we've been talking about, projecting the resilience of forest structure or function. And by function, I might mean things like water yield or biodiverse habitat for certain types of species. Projecting resilience of these attributes of forests to changing climate, changing fire behavior, changing disturbance regimes. Another objective may be, under certain circumstances, exploring both carbon and forest resilience responses to different management or treatment options for particular landscapes or particular watersheds or projects. I think another objective that has come up is using models to help, along with data, estimate both past forest conditions or forest carbon and the current state of carbon on the landscape where we have incomplete observations. And then finally, just the objective of transparency and reproducibility in modeling use for public policy, I think is its own objective that kind of cuts across all of these. Okay, next. So an understandable drive when approaching these different objectives is to want to know, like, which model is better, which one is right, which one should we use. And there's no single answer to all those questions, as any modeler will tell you, because no model does all the things that we would ideally like it to do with equal and excellent skill. So this is a refrain that you hear modelers say often. It's a paraphrase of a longer comment, but it basically means that models aren't reality. But a well-vetted model used for the purpose it was intended can offer insight. So this is the thing, you know, to always keep in mind. Okay, next. Okay, so I'm going to talk about a couple different types of models. At the first kind of hierarchy or split that I'll talk about is this distinction between statistical models and process-based models. So statistical models will predict one or a small number of quantities, for example, stand biomass or tree growth rate, from a suite of variables, relying only on historical observations. And so this class of models includes modern statistical techniques such as machine learning algorithms, and especially with these sort of modern methods can be very accurate, but this class of models is typically not well suited for predictions under conditions that have never been seen in the past, like climate change, because it relies on historical relationships. Process-based models, if you can click forward, on the other hand, will predict often many different quantities using systems of equations that represent the theory of forest ecology that's been built up over many years. And these models still rely on observations. So they rely on historical observations, though, that to determine the equations to use in the process-based model. They rely on historical observations for some of the model parameters, and they rely on observations to evaluate model performance. So they're not data-free, you know, only theory type models, but they use data in a different way. And these process-based models are typically designed for prediction under new conditions grounded in theory. Okay, next. All right, so getting a little bit deeper, instead of talking about all types of machine learning for statistical models, I just want to call out one example because it's gaining a lot of traction in a lot of parts of natural resource management, and I think it's useful to just say a little bit about machine learning methods, which fall, again, under this statistical modeling framework. So machine learning models are a branch of artificial intelligence, or part of a branch of artificial intelligence that finds patterns in data and uses them for prediction. And so these types of models are, you know, entirely data-driven and can be very accurate, but they're very data intensive. And so they're best used for predicting quantities that are very well observed. They are also, they tend to be strong for prediction of those well observed quantities, but not for understanding why that prediction is what it is. You can't go back and interrogate and understand what is it that gives rise to this result. So as a result, these types of models are well suited to things like species distribution modeling, and these methods have been widely used in species distribution modeling for a long time. Monitoring carbon fluxes, forest health, or land cover change, for example, where you have a high temporal extent or a high spatial extent of data. Predicting, and they also have started to be used to predict really well observed aspects of wildfire behavior. So something like burned area. People have started to predict burned area, for example, using machine learning methods. So these models are not suited to prediction under conditions, as I said, that have never been seen in the past. They're also not really suited to developing projections of highly detailed scenarios that you might want to, explore, because you don't have that kind of underlying control of causal relationships or underlying, understanding of causal relationships. And then I'll just comment that this class of models is basically untested for looking at things like forest dynamics. So like the growth, mortality, regeneration of forest. Okay, so moving right along. Now I'm going to say a bit about process-based forest models. And I want to start at the stand scale with forest stand models. So forest stand models have two different origin stories, and I want to contrast these really explicitly because it has implications for how you might consider the results from these two different types of approaches. So one origin story is the growth and yield model based origin story, which is a class of models that will simulate the growth of a whole stand or even of individual trees using historical growth rates that have been observed often over multi-year increments. So not year by year, but like after 5 years and then after 10 years and so forth. And the basic approach with this type of model is pretty computationally efficient as a result, and it can be very accurate locally, so long as there haven't been major deviations from the past conditions that were used to estimate those tables, those growth and yield tables. So things like stand density or species mix or climate, very importantly. And so this is often referred to as an empirical approach to stand modeling. But I do want to emphasize that these models can be run at like the individual tree scale. The other approach I'll call individual-based gap models. And these individual-based gap models are typically more complex in terms of the processes that they represent with respect to annual growth. For example, annual growth would be dependent on varying abiotic conditions, such as the light environment. So a key issue really for these stand models to kind of understand is that that those that are based on these empirically derived growth curves that don't explicitly include the effects of climate variability in their predictions won't represent the effects of climate change on tree growth and therefore carbon accumulation rates like out into the future. So yes, so the stand level models, and I'm going to say a bit more here about stand level models. There is an incredibly long list of models out there in the world that model tree growth and mortality and regeneration at the stand scale. Like, can you move ahead one, please? So forest stand models, oh, that's funny. There's a picture missing. It's okay. I don't think it's, no, it's just, right. It's just like a little GIF that shows trees growing, disappearing. But anyway, you know, kind of parsing through the stand models is a project in and of itself because they vary so widely. But what I've done here is I just listed a small handful of models, both that kind of come from both of these classes, the growth and yield-based models and individual-based gap models. And I included some links to studies that have used these models in California. So if you have an interest, feel free to take a look. But in general, at this scale, forest stand models are simulating establishment, growth, and mortality of individual trees and competition on patches of forest. And typically, multiple separate patches that are less than about 1/4 of an acre are simulated. And then these different patches are aggregated or averaged to estimate what the larger scale forest stand dynamics might be. These models are typically calibrated to specific sites and species, and they have a long history of use for simulating forest responses to management. As I've already highlighted, some of these models in this class have limited climate sensitivity, and also one critique has been that they often have relatively simple approaches to mortality, simulating mortality. And in general, across the whole class of models, there typically is no interaction between the stand structure and the available soil water. So there's not a dynamic feedback. If you have a denser stand that's using more water, that won't draw the soil moisture down. The soil moisture is sort of external to the model prediction. So these models are typically suited to local near-term forest response to management. And they're typically not suited to simulating forest conversion to other vegetation types because they don't really represent these other vegetation types. They're forest models, forest stand models. And they also are not typically suited to simulations across large landscapes. Okay, that being said, some stand models do have frameworks that allow them to be run over large landscapes. And in effect, you're stitching together many of these smaller sites across a very large landscape. All right, so like I mentioned, there's a really large diversity of models in this class, and whether one is suitable for simulating something like response to drought or response to climate change is really going to be model specific. So you know the devil's in the details. Okay, next slide. So there are two other classes of model that I'll process-based models that I want to talk about. One is forest landscape models, and the other is large-scale forest, what I call large-scale forest ecosystem models, which have the former are really focused on spatially connecting processes, and the latter are more focused on kind of higher complexity representation of physiology and physical processes. Okay, next slide. So forest landscape models. So these are similar in many ways to stand models, but they are used across much larger domains. They were really developed to emphasize these spatially connecting processes. So things like seed dispersal or the spread of fire or the spread of insect outbreaks or pathogens that have a spatial component to them. These models tend to have a relatively high complexity in the way that they represent disturbance and mortality processes, because these were a kind of a particular focus of the model developers in this space. The calibration that modelers undertake with this type of model really emphasizes matching statistics over larger spatial extents, so they may be less accurate locally. So if you're focused on a particular stand, they're not going to be as accurate as a stand scale model, right? But at a larger landscape, overall, they'll be calibrated. They'll be better calibrated to that larger landscape. They also can, as with stand models, lack an interaction between the stand condition and the soil water. Again, often there's not that feedback present. So these models are typically well suited to large landscape simulation of spatially connected disturbance effects. They are often not suited to simulating these two-way interactions with the physical environment. They weren't developed to handle that by and large. There are some exceptions. And I also just wanted to comment that at the core, these landscape models have stand models. And so they will inherit any limitations or strengths of the sort of core the span model that's at its core. So again, there's still a devil in the details aspect to the model as well. Okay, next slide. Large scale forest ecosystem models. So these models simulate physiological and biogeochemical processes in some detail. So what do I mean by physiological processes? What I mean is photosynthesis, respiration, transpiration. So these are the ways in which plants take up carbon, release carbon, move water through their tissues. So these types of the ways in which soils cycle nitrogen. So these are physiological and biogeochemical processes that are not always simulated in forest stand or forest landscape models. Sometimes, some of them are. So it really depends on the model. But these models really emphasize those physiological and more physical processes. These models are designed for use at larger spatial scales, so regional and even global scales. So they are often run and calibrated at coarser resolutions. As I've already said, I think they have their most complexity in terms of the representation of growth processes of all the models, all the model classes. And they do simulate generally this feedback between, say, soil conditions and the conditions of the forest. So you'll have, if you have a denser stand that uses more water, then the soil moisture will be drawn down, and that will mean there's sort of more risk of drought later in the growing season, let's say. So there is that feedback represented to varying degrees of success across the different models. These models typically lack spatially connecting processes and individual tree representation. So they often are not simulating individual trees. They'll simulate, say, a cohort of trees or an ecosystem, a stand full of trees.
What do you mean connecting processes?
Oh, spatially connecting processes in this case would be something like the spread of fire across a landscape. So instead of sort of having a spatially explicit fire spread model embedded, they will predict the ultimate size of the fire based on a kind of set of more, I would say, like empirically based rules relating to things like fire weather and fuel conditions. So like core variables that are important to tell you how big the fire would be. But unlike the landscape models that I talked about previously, which would represent that actual spread process in a spatially explicit way, these might have a range of different approaches for estimating what the ultimate outcome would be. So it varies a lot within the model. So some models will have like a rate of spread that's predicted that gives rise to the ultimate fire size, but it doesn't have any kind of spatial aspect to it. Yeah, like I said, I don't know if this is too much or too little. Okay. Yes, and then okay, so and then they don't represent individual trees typically. So as a result, this class of models, I would say, is best suited to regional scale prediction of things like carbon and water fluxes, because that's really in their wheelhouse. They're typically not as well suited to predicting the response of a specific local stand or landscape to a spatially explicit management scenario. Okay. One other type of modeling approach I just wanted to mention, when I did a practice on this with my research group, a scientist that I respect a lot, that you really should say something about these model data fusion efforts. And I think I'm just going to mention it briefly, in part because I think this is a direction that the community is going, as the field is going, especially as we start trying to fold in more and higher resolution satellite data sets into our modeling frameworks. And so these types of models are intermediate they tend to have intermediate process complexity and focus on carbon cycle processes specifically for both forest and non-forest vegetation. And they tend to be used at regional to global scales so far. This is a type of approach that really leverages both the spatially extensive satellite data that's accumulating over years now and new types of data with the process-based theory. So it's trying to bring the best of both worlds together. Say, let's merge our fundamental forest ecological theory with all these data streams and try and kind of reap the rewards of both. The challenge is that it inherits the statistical limits of the statistical models, or excuse me, it inherits the limits of the statistical models because these are these intermediate complexity process models are really strongly constrained by satellite era observations. And so this means that using this type of a modeling system to predict under novel conditions like climate change, some future climate change scenario, requires really strong assumptions about, for example, what the gross primary productivity in the future will be. And that kind of an assumption may or may not be robust. So as a consequence, this type of approach, this process-based model data fusion approach is really well suited to doing like predicting CO2 fluxes or fire-associated emissions for monitoring or short-term forecasts, where there aren't like large expected deviations from the underlying conditions that were used to train this model data fusion approach. They're not well suited to long-term simulations that would alter forest structure, where we would expect altered forest structure or composition from what the conditions were when the model was trained.
Or, sorry, real quick. You said there were some models, forest landscape models, and then this large scale forest ecosystem model. And now we're pivoting those three models to fusion.
Yes.
Okay, and then when you're talking about this, could it be any of the above or? Sorry, I just.
No, it's a good, I'm sorry. Yeah, so I this is the weeds part. This type of model, I would say, is most closely associated with the last class.
That's what seems like.
Yeah, but I think it's an approach that people are starting to think about using for other, in other ways. But I would say because right now what's out there, I would say is largely focused on these carbon cycle processes. It's really, really like the frameworks that are in existence are really at that, like they're starting at that like regional to global scale. But they are even often like lower in complexity in terms of the processes that they represent on the process-based part. Yeah. Okay. So I just want to say a couple of things about wildfire processes as they relate to forest models. So for forests, an important driver of any benefit of forest health treatments is assumed effects of wildfire in the absence of treatment. So that, when we're thinking in a modeling context, we're trying to say, like, what would have happened if we hadn't treated this forest, right? And so in the context of modeling forests, we need to have reliable simulations of the effects of wildfire on forests under climate change. So this is sort of an important requirement for some of those objectives that I put at the beginning. So wildfire processes, including the effects of fire on forests and fuels, or features of wildfire behavior itself that we might care about, so something like fire intensity or the rate of fire spread. These aspects are handled in pretty diverse ways across different forest model classes. So it can be internal to the forest model itself. Wildfire can be handled externally. So you take the output from your forest model and then you use it as part of a wildfire model. Or it can be sort of an add-on or an extension where there's some interaction. It's like a plug-in. Only the models that kind of a configuration where you have an internal wildfire model that can dynamically predict kind of you have a situation where you can dynamically predict these interactions between wildfire and vegetation over time if you're kind of simulating out into the future. If it's external, you're making an assumption about what the forest state is, and then you're looking at the fire effects. Or you're making an assumption about what the fire effects are, and then you're modeling what the forest is going to do. Okay, so fire dynamics themselves are difficult to predict, and it's obviously an active area of research, just like forest modeling is. And there's, again, a wide diversity and different approaches. There are empirical wildfire models, including machine learning wildfire models, and there are process-based approach that are used across these different model classes. So physical, that one way of dividing these up into these more physically based models versus empirically based models. And just like with the forest models, the empirically based models don't represent like the physics themselves. They're capturing the patterns based on variables that are kind of expected to provide a prediction of what a particular wildfire behavior or outcome might be. So just as with forest models, you can have a more like empirical statistical approach to modeling wildfire or a more process-based approach. Only forest landscape models have internal spatially explicit fire spread represented. The other two classes, the stand models and the large scale models, will have other approaches that are either not spatially explicit or are external. So the forest landscape models are a class that have particularly focused in on the spatial wildfire spread and that internal dynamic. Okay, so one thing I wanted to say is that models that are really well vetted for their fire effects can do a good job at predicting moderate intensity fire. But across all of the wild classes of wildfire models, I would say they struggle to predict large, severe wildfire patches. Like they don't get that kind of mass fire effect. They generally don't represent the effects of large dead fuels. So when you're looking at a situation where there's a reburn and there might be a bunch of trees that came down in the prior fire, like the fire models, especially if they're trained on some of these land fire products, are going to be, it doesn't fit but they're the way they were designed. So they don't do a very good job. And then most of these wildfire models don't capture effects on soils. And most of these, the kind of interaction between the wildfire model and the forest model doesn't do a very good job of post-fire regeneration simulation, which is something I think we've touched on a little bit already. Okay. Forest management, super brief. Models that were designed for forest operations have a ton of options for predicting forest management effects. They have prescribed fire, they have all kinds of different harvest options, thinning. Other model types really vary a lot in kind of the complexity with which you can represent forest operations or management. But they all have some complexity, there's some level of capability. All of these models for management use rule-based approaches. So there's not like a distinction between statistical and theory-based approaches for representing forest management. They are all just implementing rules of various kinds. Like we take out this many trees at this size, etc. I will notice that I'll just mention that like what happens to trees after you take them out or what happens to slash and that kind of stuff is how that's represented is really variable across the models. Should I pause for a minute before I talk about some of these other things, or should I just forge ahead? Adam says forge ahead. Get it all out there. Get it over with. Exactly. We'll do the forced march. Oy. Okay. All right.
It's
really important for actively dealing.
Okay, good.
No, I really, yeah. Okay. Yeah.
All right, so I think I said this at the beginning, and I have a whole slide on it now, and I'm not going to read you all these words, but I really want to emphasize that the choice of a model really depends on the primary objectives that you have with respect to the scale, the domain, the spatial extent that you're interested in, the time frame over which you want to do simulations, the quantities that you want to estimate, the processes that you feel are essential to capture. And so you could have a whole host of requirements that would be used to determine if a model is adequate for addressing the objectives at hand. So I put a list of questions that are too small to read in the room that you might ask to determine whether a particular model is adequate for your question or objective. Another consideration in model selection is the accuracy, precision, and uncertainty associated with the model. So is a model well vetted for the relevant forest type that you're interested in simulating? Is it vetted for the quantities that you want to simulate? Because some models may be really well vetted for biomass, but they might not be well vetted for forest structure, and vice versa. Okay. Although it's harder to get the structure right and the biomass wrong, unless you're not doing anything about dead biomass, which could be a liability of some models.
When you say vetted, you mean like
That's it, evaluated against observation.
right? Okay.
Yeah. Also, a question for model selection would be: are the sources of uncertainty understood and quantified? And I'll say more about uncertainty in a minute. I think another criterion when you're thinking about selecting a model for particular decision support is whether there's strong governance and support for that model. Is the code accessible to the people who would need to be looking at the model code, running it, understanding it, and transparent? And is there a clear approach to user support? Is there a active user community with the model that's maintaining it, fixing bugs? Is there some other approach to support that's available? And then, how well is a particular model matched for the resources that you have available? So there are all kinds of resources you could think about. One would be the computational cost. You have access to the computational resources to simulate the full complexity model that you'd really love to use. Is there storage available for the model output? How will you store it? How will you maintain that model output for whatever duration it needs to be maintained? And is there internal technical capacity to run the model and interpret the model output? And there are, other resources that I'm sure I'm not thinking of. A last kind of consideration that I didn't put on this slide, but I'll just mention is, how easy is it to translate model output from your forest model, let's say, to another type of model that you might want to use to understand how changes in forests might change other values. So things like water yield or endangered species habitat. So does the model output the variables that you need to understand habitat change? If it only gives you carbon, that might not tell you what you need to know about whether the habitat is going to be suitable. Okay. So there are trade-offs in model selection, right? Computational cost might trade off against the state of the model readiness for use in your particular site, or there's a trade-off between the richness of processes that might be represented in a model and its, computation, how many compute hours you need to basically get an answer to your question. So there's not only thinking about all these different requirements, but thinking about how to prioritize. Okay, model uncertainty. So models of forest dynamics in response to change are fundamentally uncertain. And this inherent uncertainty in model predictions doesn't invalidate the projections. So those two things are both true. Like that uncertainty is there, but it doesn't make these models invalid for the purposes that we want to use them. But uncertainty really needs to be considered as a part of the modeling process from the get-go. And there are multiple different types or sources of uncertainty that need to be understood. So for example, the starting conditions for your modeling exercise might not be perfectly known. So if you're doing some sort of near-term projection of how a particular treatment might influence the forest, 10 or 20 years out, that will be really strongly influenced by your assumption of what the current forest structure is when you start your model. And if that is imperfectly known, that will contribute uncertainty to the simulation of the forest response. So that's what modelers often call initial condition uncertainty, and improving measurements of forest condition that contribute most to that uncertainty will really improve your prediction, right? So this is where data comes even into process-based models. Also, errors in the theory that is sort of expressed in the model algorithms. So we have theories that are built up through experimentation and long-term study that inform the way that the equations are written in the model, the algorithms are put into process models. And if you use just one model, then you have essentially one approach to how to translate that theory into systems of equations or algorithms. If you use multiple models, you're likely to have multiple different ways of implementing that theory, and you will express the uncertainty in that sort of model, I guess, the way we understand the theory to be expressed. And so having multiple models or model diversity is really advantageous, but it's also really expensive, right? It adds computational costs. It means you need to know how to run two different types of models.
Are there any examples that come to the top of your head for like interpreting ecological theory and turning it into a system of equations? And just, when my brain reaches out for it, I'm like, maybe for fire modeling, we think of like the Rothermel equations, but those are already equations. There's no interpretation necessary there. So what's maybe an example of turning an ecological theory that's, not quantitatively based necessarily into a.
Yeah. So by theory, I don't mean it's not quantitative. So, but you have choices. So, for example, actually, we were talking about this earlier, right? So, we understand that as trees grow through their lifetimes, there is a kind of a period, or let's say not trees, we'll say forests. As forests grow and accumulate carbon, carbon accumulation in the forest might start out at a relatively steep pace, and then it might plateau. And that's something that foresters have understood to be due to essentially canopy closure, and essentially where previously there wasn't competition for light, now there's intense competition for light. And so forest growth might not be as fast as it was in the earlier phases, right? But earlier we were talking about, well, we actually have, a lot of those observations came from forestry, right? When we're trying to figure out what is the optimal density of planting we should have in our forests for yielding timber, right? We have fewer observations of forest growth rates over succession in naturally occurring forests. And so we have less constraint on how fast really old forests can grow. And so there was earlier this conversation about, well, should growth be assumed to plateau, or is there potential actually for that growth to stay on some sort of relatively steep trajectory? So one model might assume that that growth plateaus and another may allow for the possibility of increased growth because as forest complexity changes, the way light moves through the canopy changes and you get an increase in, there's a term called rugosity, which is basically like the complexity of how light bounces around through a canopy. And you can actually maintain relatively high growth rates in complex forest canopies, which you would never see in a plantation forest because all the canopies are the same, all the tree canopies. So that's, it's sort of taking our understanding and translating, you know, we have this curve and you might make a curve like this, you might make a curve like that, and that will totally give you a different prediction of how much carbon accumulation you get in old forest.
We've seen that play out in lots and lots of scenarios where people go, oh gee, those 200-year-old forests are still growing. It, maybe the rate slows down, but they're still at that growth. They're not in decline. And we've seen that time and time and time again because so many of those models were growth and yield models designed for relatively short periods of time for trees rather than forests. They didn't have the data on what those processes should be, so they weren't able to plug them into models. Now we are in a little bit better position.
But I think even, you know, even with the same data, a modeling team might come away with a different assumption. Because if the data is noisy in those old trees, it might still be reasonable to assume that plateau. And one modeling approach might assume it and another might not.
Yeah, one expression of that characteristic of old growth forests is they have a very, very low albedo. So they're very effective in trapping light. And they're very effective in trapping diffuse lights, which is particularly the conifer forest on the West Coast, which are often covered by clouds. And we see photosynthesis in the winter at low light levels. We see them really being optimized for that kind of environment. And then going back to, you know, ecological models and understanding this in the 70s or so, that the hypothesis for old growth forests was that they were decadent. You know, classical ecologists said they're all kind of decaying, they're really not productive anymore. And it took a long time. It probably took multiple decades from when I started my PhD work to really getting that accepted in the literature. There was a lot of back and forth where people said that's really not interested to science overall, and it's also, you know, like violating some of these ecological standing models that we have. And it's interesting to see how we can challenge with data, you know, the principles that we sometimes have in our minds, and sometimes we need to step back and listen to the data again and revisit what we think happens in these forest ecosystems. And that's what the models are so valuable for, because they can always push us to try to test our understanding.
So it's both the inclusion of and the interpretation of different results in these models.
Yeah, and when I was particularly talking about the uncertainty that comes from like different model, like implementing theory into model equations or algorithms, it's sort of it's that process of taking data and translating it into an understanding that is quantitative, and then representing that understanding in the model itself. And that process like involves people interpreting information differently. And so they may have different information, or they may have, like one other thing I came to appreciate early in my career was that a lot of the forest theory that I was learning in school came from East Coast forests, where nitrogen controls everything and water. So water was not a constraint in these models, wasn't thought to control like, you know, what was happening, but nitrogen was very important. Well, out here, it's kind of a different story. Like water seems to be like a pretty important factor, right? And we don't talk about nitrogen as such. So that means that, you know, like a modeler who is studying forests out here might not even bother putting nitrogen in the model, whereas a modeler developing a forest model on, you know, in the East wouldn't bother putting soil moisture constraints in their model. So there's a lot of different things that contribute to heterogeneity or variability in the processes that are in a model. And so this is where it contributes uncertainty into the predictions because there are assumptions that are made both what to include, what to exclude, and how to interpret particular understanding that will give rise to a diversity of representations. And if you just run one model, you're just choosing one view of the world. You're just saying, okay, these are the things that, right? Whereas if you have a couple of models, that gives you a sense of like, well, how much uncertainty is there around those assumptions? And this is why IPCC for the climate modeling, we use a whole, maybe too many, but we use a gazillion model, climate models to try and anticipate what climate is going to do, because they vary in what their predictions are based on their assumptions.
Well, one of the things that I think you brought up very early on that I think is extremely germane to the process of the scoping plan update is the transparency around data and assumptions, and what kinds of runs have been made, so that people who you want to have understand the validity of what's being put there have the ability to test that out. And I know that that's been a somewhat bedeviling issue, but I think it's a really critical one in one of your very first slides. And it then ties back to this issue of uncertainty, because if you don't have an understanding of the data source, the assumptions, the number of model runs, how you check them, you're going to fall back on this issue of, well, that's really pretty uncertain. Or I just don't understand it, or I just don't agree with
it. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Okay. Let's see. So, okay, so there's this, what I would call like algorithmic, or sometimes it's referred to as structural uncertainty. These are jargony, but really like how the theory is translated into the model algorithms is a source of uncertainty. There's also, all models are going to have some amount of internal variability that is expressed slightly differently if different parameters are selected during the calibration exercise, or if slightly different initial conditions are used. This is because of nonlinear feedbacks within some models. And so if you have slightly, kind of have slight differences in the way you set up a model, even though it has the same, the same theory, the algorithms haven't changed, you might get a different trajectory out of it. And this is just, like I said, because of nonlinear feedbacks within the model. So this is another type of uncertainty that can get expressed. And then I think another important source of uncertainty to always keep in mind is, of course, scenario uncertainty, or what we can also can think about as driving condition uncertainty. This can contribute really large variation in model predictions. And this is really a factor when you're studying the effects of climate change, because climate models and emission scenarios produce different climate trajectories for California. So some of them will make Northern California wet and hot. Well, Southern California is. Some of them will make parts of California wet and hot. Some of them will make it cool or dry and hot. They have differences in the periodicity of droughts, or the periodicity of things like El Nino. So all these are all different. There are different sort of choices you can make about what driving conditions to use. And I think the state has come up with a pretty systematic way of addressing that type of uncertainty. There's been a process to sort of adopt certain types of models, and there's a whole nother crowd of people that sits and dissects those types of models and what kind of assumptions should be made. And I'm just making the assumption here that will be built off of in any effort that's made in this forest modeling space, as opposed to starting from scratch. But
so are you just referring to the Myron versus Hadley models, or what do you give for not for this room, but for perhaps some on the line?
Yeah, so if you choose a global climate model, output from a particular global climate model to run your forest model, that will give you a particular answer. And then if you choose output from a different global climate model, your answer will be different.
I was just wondering if because Myron and Hadley represent the two ends of that spectrum. So I was wondering.
Yeah, I mean, so with the, I actually am not up to speed because I haven't followed too closely what the current model selection where they're landing, but I know that there's been a big effort put on dynamic regional downscaling, as well as new statistical downscaling and using the AR6 models. And so I think there's going to be like a whole new.
They're doing it right now.
Yeah, it's like in process, because I have the guy who's in the office next to me is involved in that project.
Yeah.
So there's going to be a whole new like data dump, right?
Yeah, some of it's already out, some of the temperature and precipitation, hydrology, sea level rise is out, wildfire's not. It's out in preliminary form now to be used to derive any results from, but yeah, this is all a part of the 5th climate change assessment that's underway right now and will wrap in sometime probably in 2026. So yeah, process.
Right. So anyway, there's a lot of knowledge through that process around scenario uncertainty that can be used to inform the types of scenarios that one might want to run to address scenario uncertainty in our forests. Okay, so in general, the last thing I'll say about uncertainty is that, uncertainty itself is better known and better constrained when we have data. And so any data limitations for things like model parameterization and model evaluation can be a limitation on the confidence that we might have in our predictions, or the kind of ability to even understand what the uncertainty is. Okay.
You guys, it says recording has stopped. So if we're.
Oh, it's got the little red dot recording up in the corner.
Oh, maybe it's just one particular type of person's recording. All right. The last kind of slide I have here is just some modeling best practices, and I put some because I'm sure there are others that I didn't think of. This was sort of just my first pass set of ideas, but I think one that I've already alluded to is defining the model questions clearly and specifically. So what variables you want to predict. A second would be using the questions to define the model selection criteria as opposed to the other way around. And again, of course, model selection will also be influenced by model quality and governance and support and these other things, but what is the question, and then matching the model to the questions, kind of the best practice, I would say. Establishing reasonable performance benchmarks. So this is a little bit jargony, but what I mean is this ahead of time, deciding what you need the model to be able to do a good job at, and then testing to see if the model can do a good job at those things before moving ahead to doing, like projections or something. So if it needs to do a good job of predicting biomass or stand structure or large severe wildfires, like decide that is what it has to do a good job at and check to see if it can do a good job at that before moving ahead. Another thing, I didn't know where to put this in the order, but in addition to calibrating a model for the region of focus or the landscape or stand of focus, if you want to take it outside of that location where you've done the effort of testing the model performance and calibrating it, you can't just take a model that's been calibrated for, say, Northern Sierra and apply it to Southern California Sky Island forests. Or, model portability is a real challenge. And so you have to be cognizant that a model that's calibrated well for one location isn't going to necessarily work well straight away at another location. There's a whole other calibration exercise that may be needed, and there may also be new requirements for that location that you have to take into account.
What's an example of that? Just like the models you displayed today, let's go with large landscapes. Is there a model that's hitting on large landscapes that like sit in California that isn't supportable?
Well, I'll use my example of the model that I use. We've been putting a lot of effort into testing and calibrating it for Sierra Nevada forests. But I would never take that model and apply it in coastal Northern California. Okay. Because we have different species, we have different species with different perhaps growth velocities, we have climate is different, and so, at the very least, we would need to check. Well, the most in our case is, like, are we representing the plant properties? Well, way the plants grow and just their vulnerabilities to disturbance agents.
And then I guess so can we tear off of that to some of the things that I know were really significant questions in the last scoping plan? Where one of the constraints was, well, we need to use, number one, data sets that are statewide and same scale, same time. We need to use a model that we can use across the state. Recognizing all the heterogeneity in the state. The question arises about how much time was available to do the parameterization, the characterization of each of these areas, given our diversity, and what outcome there. How will that change in the next scoping plan update, or what are your thoughts and plans on changing that? Or is it, do you feel that it was what it needed to be, and that's how you'll keep sticking with it?
We're always improving. Right now, we're focused on updating the inventory. We're not there to the scoping plan process yet. So I hesitate to say how that's going to change because we have like a legislatively mandated time when we start that process. So I think we'll be building off of what we did last scoping plan for sure, but definitely improving it. It'll change absolutely, and we learned a lot during that last process, and also incorporating it more into the inventory so there's more consistency between the inventory and the future projections and things like that.
And that's the RESIS model, or is that?
Yep, we use RESIS and we'll most likely continue to use RESIS. Yeah.
What does the forest module look like in that?
Forest.
I mean, like, how does RESIS? So that would be statewide. A lot of these models are dealing just with forests. The RESIS would be across ecosystems.
Right. So RESIS is one of these like large landscape models that in Laura's classification there. It does actually it's agnostic to the biome type. So we're modeling forests, shrublands, grasslands, and how we parameterize it and how we run it is we parameterize it for 12 what we call eco units around the state. So talking about this portability issue, like Laura's talking about, we calibrate it to these different places. And one of the reasons why that model was chosen was because it is one of these process-based models that model photosynthesis, evapotranspiration, the effects of soil, water, and all of these things, but it also has this spatial process involved. So it has hydrology, so water does move through space in this model. Fire also moves through space in this model based off of fuel moistures and fuel loads and things like that. And so you have this tight coupling between vegetation, growth, water, climate, fire. And so it's extremely complex, this model. It's extremely complex. And so, what we're hoping to do moving forward is take the exercise that we did, which last time was like a representative simulation. So simulating representative watersheds, sort of scaling those outcomes up and doing a larger, hopefully, potentially wall-to-wall scale runs with that model. That's the ultimate goal. Eventually we'll get there, who knows if it's going to be the next scoping plan or the one after that, but that's the direction we're moving. So, we undertook similar processes that Laura laid out on, setting out your questions, determining your metrics, and then deciding on your model based off of that. And you can look at it, all that, like that process in the scoping plan that's in our appendix, like how we landed on RESIS as our model, why, And yeah, if you want like all of the input data, that's also there. And the model is open source. Anybody can run the model. Now that doesn't mean you understand the model, so that's an issue. And like I said, it's a very complex model, so it's not like, I mean, it's there, like, where you can use it, but you know, running it is extremely difficult. So yeah, I don't know if there's any other questions on that. Yeah.
Okay, I'm almost done. I think the last two comments on the modeling best practices were developing an approach to characterizing and understanding the uncertainty of predictions and conducting the modeling study then consistent with the original question that led you to choose the model in the first place, right? So there's a risk of scope creep when you get your hands on a model. Because they're like, oh, look at all these things that it can do. But if you have embedded it for those things and you didn't choose it to do those, for those reasons, then like you have to have a little restraint because you may end up getting yourself in trouble. And then of course, interpreting the results that you get in the context that you're setting out, that you set out with. So I guess just to conclude, I think we're now in a situation where we can run thousands of simulations of extremely complex models that were really the dream of early forest modelers. And that capacity for simulation, I think it really should be harnessed by the state. And it's super exciting to see all the efforts that are taking off. We can do a good job answering basic questions about things like the rate of carbon accumulation or loss. That this is simulated by all these classes of models, and when they're well calibrated, they can do I think a good job for the timeframes and conditions that they're well suited to. Other processes like regeneration, large severe wildfires, conversion to non-forest vegetation types might be shortcomings in many of the models, but they're not going to remain shortcomings forever because people who are developing these models are interested in a lot of the same kinds of questions that the state wants to know the answers to. So, there's active improvements to all of these models that are happening in real time.
Matt has a question.
Yeah.
Matt? Your hand is up.
Yeah, thanks. I mean, it was really quite similar. I'm sorry if it's a little loud. I'm still standing outside. But it was with regards to the modeling. Can you hear me all right, Adam?
Maybe it might be up, but he doesn't know that it's up. So,
yeah. Well, I just for the record, notwithstanding the technical difficulties of non-state agencies.
Speaker's muted.
Yes, our speaker on.
there's also these speakers here, which they seem to be on.
Hold on.
Well, others is.
Hey, can I give it another shot?
Here you
Now
are.
we can hear him.
Yeah.
Yes.
I just, notwithstanding the technical difficulty of operating this model outside of the state, is there a place where, modeling supporters can get a hold of the inputs that the state used in its initial NWL modeling efforts?
So none of the inputs we use are proprietary, and we cite all of the data sources. So yeah, I mean they're out
Okay,
there.
great. So modeling partners would be able to contact CARB, secure those inputs, and then run them through the same model with, of course, the toggles and alterations that models are supposed to provide us with.
Yeah. I mean, you don't even actually need to contact us. You can just look at the documentation and download everything. Yeah.
Okay, well, I wanted to make sure that was on the record because there's dissonance around that issue outside of the state. So thank you, Adam.
Yep.
Nadia?
Hi, thank you. Nadia Tace at CAL FIRE. That was a really great presentation. One, I'm just hoping you can share those slides. We're actually working on a GTR to summarize model comparisons because people have these types of questions and we have different efforts using different models. I think you made a point at one point about how it's also good to use different models to see how everything lines up with each other. And, I know I'm new to this group. This is the first meeting I've been at. Just hearing some of the questions about the scoping plan modeling. But we at CAL FIRE recently did some modeling using a different model, and it aligned. We tried to use, as Matt mentioned, like the same inputs and that sort of a thing. We were able to explore some questions a little differently and that sort of a thing, but our efforts ultimately aligned with what came out of the scoping plan modeling and maybe even predicted greater losses in some regards without action. And so I do kind of just wonder, like, what is the space for how we might consider other modeling efforts? There is and there are other agencies setting targets, and there's the the governor's task force doing similar work. And with this knowledge that no one single model is going to be correct, what's a good way to think about how we bring it all together to kind of capture the strengths and limitations of these different models?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's great value in having multiple models at the table, in part for giving confidence to decisions that can be, important or surprising or have big implications. That doesn't mean there isn't still room for surprise. There are things, like I said, that are weaknesses across all these different models in terms of their ability to represent. And so you have to kind of always keep that in mind when you're thinking about comparing models to each other. There's a sort of universe within which they tell you about, this is Donald Rumsfeldian, but they tell you about the known unknowns in a sense, and the uncertainty there, right? But if there's something that's missing altogether that exists in reality and is in none of the models, that aspect of uncertainty won't be brought out. But I think so that there's a degree of quality even when you use a diversity of models that always has to be kept in mind. But I guess the other thing I will say is that I think like I see this also, that there are a lot of different modeling efforts that are being conducted and are really, needed from different parts of the state. And to the degree to which there can be coordination and communication around that, I think there's potential for like learning and I guess leveraging of resources. Thinking about these model inputs, it can be very time consuming to take output from a global climate model and format it appropriately to be input to some other impact model, right? And should every agency do that itself? Or should there be one process where, there's like some formatting workflows that can be leveraged by everyone? I think there are efficiencies that can, even if the specific models might have some differences, I think there may be, certain types of data sets that all of these modeling exercises are going to want to use. Can there be ways of coordinating on that so that, people aren't doing the same thing over and over again in different agencies? So, yeah, those are just a couple of thoughts in response to your question and comment.
I just wanted to jump in too. Yeah, so that's kind of what we would like, is for as many people to basically replicate our work, which will help us really understand what will happen in the future. Because just as Laura was saying, no model is perfect, and I think the scoping plan modeling was amazing, but it's still just one modeling exercise. And so what we would like is for others, just like CAL FIRE did, was to take some of the scenarios that we were thinking about and the questions we had and replicate those with other models, Yeah, just kind of add to the body of information that we have about what the future is going to look like. So yeah, we welcome anybody to us, and we'll help you sort of, yeah, kind of replicate what we've done. So, but just also like what Laura said, is running these models takes a tremendous amount of work, and so it's not like CARB can just run 3 or 4 models doing the same exact exercise. So that's why you need other groups also doing it.
Adam, how would you see incorporating or not the kind of data that, looking at like what Andrew was illustrating about fine scale variability, finer scale variability and fire impacts, and the fact that we're seeing that the large majority of the fires that have happened in the last 10 years have actually been low to moderate intensity? And how would you utilize those two factors, the heterogeneity of the fire impact as opposed to the fire perimeter data, and the learning that we've had to date about the intensity and therefore impact of fire?
Yeah, so
the future stuff.
Yeah, so that goes back to like how we calibrate the dynamics of our model. So we do have like this multi-step process of how we calibrate like such a complex model. First, it's like, okay, let's get the vegetation growing right and all of that. And then let's make sure like the subsurface water stuff's right. Okay, and now let's calibrate the fire piece. And so the fire piece often is like, okay, under historical conditions, are we getting the right fire frequencies? Are we getting the right fire severities? Things like that. And so then we look spatially, we do some statistics and things and say, okay, yeah, it looks like it's sort of matching what the historic maps would predict. So that's kind of how we take that into account.
Well, I get that, but I mean, our historic fire data is enormously skewed because of fire suppression. And now we're seeing fire return. We have these data that are a little bit more recent, the last 10 years, and they're showing a lot more variability than what people were thinking.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I get the theory. I'm asking.
This is why you use a process-based model, right? So the idea is that, yeah, we can capture the historic stuff, but also we should be able to capture some, like as temperature grows or you have this huge drought or something, fire sizes change and things like that. Or if suppression is input into the model, which is something we built into RESIS as like a new function into our model. If suppression is on, do models or fires stay small? If suppression's off, do they grow? And you see, is your model behaving the way that you would expect? Yes. Okay. It's process-based model. So just like Laura was saying, we should be able to use this under novel conditions, such as climate change, and into the future. So if your theory is right and the dynamics are correct, then you should be able to simulate a future that has not been seen in the past. And that's the objective of what we're trying to do. We're using the best science and data available. Is it sufficient? Well, I don't know. I guess we'll have to wait and see. But
And one other thing, I'm just kind of reflecting on your question and Adam's answer is that there may be situations where a different type of model might be suited to thinking about a particular landscape where regeneration, like alternate assumptions about regeneration might be made that have sort of like a particular model that has features that might not be in RESIS with respect to individual tree spacing and, seed production, differences in legacy, the way legacy trees and, it might be a model that is very rich in the way, like there's a model called TreeMig, anyway, that has like extremely detailed representations of regeneration. And for a limited area study to look at the implications of, different severity classes and these assumptions around the timing of the fire, when the seed is produced or whatever, like maybe Rhesus doesn't go down the, that particular rabbit hole. But this other model does, and one might be able to do a limited area study to see how much of a difference it makes to the outcome after 10 years. And if the outcome after 10 years is like very similar to what Rhesus might predict with a simpler formulation, then maybe we don't need to worry about it. Or maybe it is very different. And then we have to think about in version X of the scoping plan, like enriching the way that the regeneration dynamic is handled. And so I think it's always an iterative process and leveraging the strengths of particular models that are out there to kind of explore whether the investment is needed to incorporate some of those details might be one way to ratchet ourselves without committing too many resources towards something that we don't know if it's significant.
I think that that's always a really good approach. I think the other side of this, which is, it's looking at our future scenarios. And number one, are we capturing the emissions from fire accurately or not? And I don't really know the answer to that in Rhesus. I'll tell you that maybe you all can somewhere offline kind of boil down some of the many hundred pages of documentation that you have put out there. So there's one is, how is the variability and intensity reflected in the quantity of carbon emitted? And then two, how the future reforestation patterns impact are reflected in Rhesus modeling. So if we have a comparison, if you're doing alternate scenarios, if one scenario uses ICO, the individual's clumps and openings, and the other scenario uses standard plantation approaches, what do you see? Are you seeing a difference there because you're capturing what we observe on the ground? The great value of being in the field in terms of fire spread. And those are material simply because they really impact. What are you saying is the CO2 emission and the future sequestration and the stability of that sequestration? So ways to test that out, I think, would be really, really valuable and would build confidence in the outcomes because they are more representative of what we see on the ground. And that drives a lot of resources and a lot of policies.
One thing I just wanted to add is that, this is what I say also in other groups that we work in, other ecosystems. Ecosystems literally are infinitely complex.
True.
You can add, there is no end to the amount of complexity that you can add to these models. And so, but we have limited resources and limited time. And so it's really about thinking about your question. What is your objective? And looking for those biggest drivers of change on the scale that you're thinking about and making sure that those dynamics are included in your model and working right. And then you can start like thinking about other functionality. But, we get all sorts of people coming wanting all sorts of functionality built into the model that it's just, we cannot add every single thing. So, yeah, that's just one thing I want to
Absolutely. But that's why we focus this conversation on fire, because it is such a big influence on the landscape. And we know that that dynamic is not going to go away. So that's, I think, why we've taken some time to do a little bit deeper dive within this, recognizing your constraints. Did you want to wrap up and we can go to other people's questions as well?
Oh, yeah. I think I'm done. I will make these slides available. I guess the only other thing I just wanted to, I think I've said this already, but advances in modeling depends not just on like changes to the model code like Adam was talking about, but also developing long-term observational data and improving our understanding of key phenomena like we were just referring to through experimentation and empirical studies. So, I think often we think about modeling or these other kinds of science, that will advance our knowledge, but it's really like you need the two together. So that was that. And then, yeah, these slides I think will be available. At the end, I have the references that I included in the slides and a couple of papers that might be, that review model types
for people who are interested in looking more at that. That's all.
Amy, were you going to talk a little bit more about remote sensing data and interactions with models, since we touched base on that during the break?
I can if it's helpful, yeah. If people aren't peppered out.
I think there's interest in that, yes.
Sure. Yeah. Should I start?
Please.
I just want to take a quick second and just second what Laura just said about observation data. It is really critical that we have those observations, not just of the forested spaces or the vegetation, but of active fire, because they make a huge difference in being able to model things accurately and for model improvement and development. So just a plug for that. That is my perpetual soapbox. So I'm just going to run through a few sensors, a few remote sensing platforms that I use very regularly and have found to be really useful in looking at vegetation and particularly in the context of wildfire behavior and vegetation monitoring. So I'm going to start with my favorite, which is Sentinel-2. It's a constellation of 2 satellites that have been put up into orbit through the European Space Agency. The data is freely available. It's a multispectral system that's designed specifically for monitoring forest spaces. And so it has about where we are. I'm in Montana, you guys are in California, but your return time should be, your revisit time should be very similar. Ours is about 4 to 5 days. So you will get coverage of the space that you are currently in every 4 to 5 days. And the image is available at a 20 to 30 meter resolution, depending on which band you're looking at. So that means that for my applications in wildfire modeling, that is perfectly adequate for that application. You're not going to get an individual tree level understanding at that resolution, but you will be able to get a really decent sense of forest health, or be able to generate some vegetation layers for use in most fire behavior models that are used operationally, if they're used operationally. This is a particularly special sensor because it includes a red edge band. So that data is being collected in that band is the spectrum where the spectral reflectance of green vegetation changes really rapidly. So it's great for detecting indicators of plant stress very early on. So if you're if you're looking at this data over time, which is pretty good revisit time. So every 4 to 5 days, you could look at this imagery and see if there's any indication of plant stress in that area that you're looking at. I use that data. Thanks, Melissa Ward. It was nice to have you in here. She's going to drop off. I use the Sentinel-2 data for looking at fuel types, and I'll get into that in a minute or two. I'm just going to quickly go through these sensors, speak about where you can find them, and then talk a little bit about the use of this data and what it can tell you. So another sensor that I use quite a bit is Sentinel-1. You probably can guess from the name that it also comes from the European Space Agency. Sentinel-1 is a C-band synthetic aperture radar, so that's basically, it's a specific band of radar imagery. It's also a constellation of 2 satellites. It also has a revisit time of about 4 to 5 days at our latitude. It has a spatial resolution of about 10 meters, which is really, really good. For a satellite, that's pretty good. It's very, very useful for looking at structure and texture. So this data is very useful in concert with the Sentinel-2 data, because the Sentinel-2 data will give you that a sense of the greenness, while Sentinel-1 will give you a sense of the structure and the texture. And in combination, they do a good job of helping distinguish between different plant types. not necessarily species level, but definitely you can distinguish between plant types and get a sense of what the dominant plant type in each pixel is. That both of those systems have been in orbit since about 2017, and so the data record is not very long, but it's long enough that you can get a sense of a little bit of change seasonally, and you can, they'll be in orbit for a little while. They're going to be functional for a little while longer. So I think overall that data is very, very useful. The other satellite-based sensor that I use quite a bit, and most people do, are Landsat. It's really pretty classic. It's an Earth observing satellite mission that comes through NASA. Probably you're all familiar with this. Has a continuous record that goes back nearly 50 years, despite that record being covered by several different satellites, the actual body in orbit. The record is continuous going through all of that succession of satellites. And so that data is available generally. It's a revisit time of about every 2 weeks to 1 month, and that is contingent on whether or not there are clouds. It's, again, spectral data, so you might have some clouds in there that are obscuring what you want to look at. This resolution, the spatial resolution, is about 30 meters. And again, that's really dependent on which band you want to look at, but on average, they're about 30 meters. And these satellites are intended for looking at land use and land change. So they have specifically great for that. And it uses this Landsat provides the data that we use for calculating composite burn index. So that's a metric of fire severity. And this, thinking about composite burn index and fire severity, it makes me think of what y'all were saying about being very cautious about the type of metric or the model that you're using in the environment that you're using it in. Composite burn index is one of those that you really want to be cautious about the space that you're using it in, because not all forest types have, like we said, the same spectral reflectance values, and that is going to really influence the results of what you're modeling. And so these are Landsat and composite burn index, very good for the contiguous US, maybe not so great for boreal forests and everything up in Alaska. So definitely just want to emphasize that caution about what data you're using, what models and metrics you're using in which spaces. 2 more sensors. JEDI, which is a very new high resolution laser ranging of Earth's forests and topography. That is located on the ISS. So it's 400 kilometers up in space, orbiting Earth. And that instrument has 3 lasers, and the data acquired from those lasers are used to make these 3D maps of forest structure. And that's the intention for that sensor. The data is available from 2019 onward. So again, the record is not very long, but it is very, very useful data. So that team that put the data out there, they also produce products from the data that they're collecting, similar to what's produced for MODIS or Landsat, that will give you, these guys are generating canopy height, canopy cover fraction, and above ground biomass. And I think one of the only limitations of this data is that it's not wall to wall. So because of the nature of this type of sensor, it's not like an imager. It's literally a laser ranging. It's a laser coming down and gathering data on the return. So you'll see, if you look at a map of it, it's these crisscrossing lines across the Earth that are basically like the orbit of the ISS. And so it's not wall to to in a modeling structure to build out a wall-to-wall model of a wide spatial extent of a forest. And then the other kind of limitation there is that the data is only available from 2019 onward. So you're not going to capture a ton of change, I guess, depending on where you're looking across a, what's now a 5-year record of just that sparse data. And then the last sensor that I'll mention is the Shuttle Radar Topography mission, which was flown on the Space Shuttle Endeavour in February of 2000, which feels like maybe a long time ago, but it's that mission collected topographic data, so not a ton of change in the topography of the land for the most part. That mission collected data over about 80% of the Earth's land surface, so it has a very, very wide-ranging coverage. And that mission created the first ever near global data set of land elevation. And so we use those land elevations to create topographic maps called digital elevation models. You probably are super familiar with them, but these digital elevation models give us a sense of elevation and aspect slope and the resulting landforms of the combinations of those metrics. So, which are really, really relevant to modeling things like forest growth and fire behavior. All of these, with I think the exception of JEDI, are available through Google Earth Engine, which is right now, as of right now, I think this is going to change, but on an individual basis right now, there's a freely available platform for people to go collect data and model it or visualize it. It has what I would consider kind of a moderate learning curve. You can get in there. There's a lot of tutorials and information available. There are a lot of functions available through that platform. And if you're a Python user, if you're a modeler, you can also join up. There's a Python API that you can connect. So if you're a modeler, coder, you might have a pretty easy time accessing this or getting started. But if you're not, it's also, there's, like I said, there's a ton of resources available for learning it if you wanted to. And as I alluded to, I'm always, if you reach out to me through email, I'm very willing to help you try to figure these things out. So don't hesitate. So yeah, that's where we get a lot of our data is through Google Earth Engine. We do a little bit of modeling through Google Earth Engine as well. The models are not super sophisticated, but they are really helpful. So there are a couple regression and classification models that are baked into the functionality of that platform already that are pretty easy to access. What I've noticed in my time as a scientist, which admittedly hasn't been super long, but what I've noticed, especially in working with firefighters, fire managers, boots on the ground people who I really appreciate, is that there's quite a disconnect between what scientists generate and what gets into operational use. So there are a lot of what I feel are metrics that may be great for monitoring that have been modeled really well, and those models have ended up in academic papers, but not into operational use. And I think that that's a lot about connection and relationship building. It doesn't happen. It also doesn't always, scientists don't always produce things for operational use, right? So there's a lot going on out there that wasn't ever intended for it, but would be useful. And so just a couple mentions that may be helpful is that there are models out there that are doing pretty well for some of the metrics that may be pretty useful for monitoring spaces. And Lori, I know you mentioned a couple of them that you thought might be interesting. A couple that came to mind, and if I missed them, just please remind me and I'll try to speak to them. But a couple that come to mind are being able to classify what kind of fuel type is on the ground. So when you're modeling fire behavior, there's usually, you'll use Scott and Bergen 40 or an Anderson 13, which are classifications of the vegetation on the ground that are calibrated for use within fire models, and they come available through Landfire as the inputs, right? Those are really, really great data sources. They unfortunately don't always reflect what's on the ground because disturbances basically can outpace the generation of those data sets. And so to adjust those or to generate new ones, you can use this data, especially the Sentinel data, to generate new fuel type maps, which is a big part of what I do at NCAR. And you do that a couple different ways, but a way that works really well and is not a huge lift is just using a random forest classification model that's trained on field data that you've collected in your area. And again, this is a great space to remind people you cannot take one that was developed in Colorado and then plop it into California and expect it to do well, and which is kind of the beauty of having scientists, engineers, field researchers everywhere. You know, have those resources if you tap into them. And so the people that are collecting field data have a role in informing the way that these models are developed through the data that they're collecting, right? And so it is very possible, and more so possible because of this growth in technology that we're witnessing right now. So field type, you can model that to your heart's content. Spectral diversity, which is my jam right now, using the expected difference in reflectance values between two pixels that are drawn randomly from the considered evaluated pixel set. So basically, if you wanted to look at how much diversity is within, how much species diversity, or an approximation, we should say, an approximation of the species diversity that you have within a forested space, you could use spectral diversity to approximate that, which is part of how it's one of the metrics that we see in looking at heterogeneity and how it relates to fire severity. So those were the two that came to mind, but if there are other metrics that are helpful for you all in monitoring or looking at resilience, then I am happy to try to point you in the right direction with those. Or in a very subjective right direction, I guess.
Terrific. Are there questions for Amy with regard to this? Data sources?
Would you guys mind stopping the share on the slides? I don't know if it's like if it's the view. Can I see you guys? So right now the biggest screen for the people online, I think, are the slides. And it's harder to see the people in the room. Oh, thanks.
Okay. Well, I think we are wrapping up the kind of substantive conversation here, unless there are any. I did not see any further questions online, and I realized, Andrew, we got to say thank you to you and let you get out.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for joining us. Well, certainly with regard to inventory, monitoring, metrics, I think there was a lot of input today. And for forward in particular, forward assessment. So this is, our last meeting is in November. And it would be great to hear what you all would like to focus in on for that meeting. We have not really touched on either grasslands or chaparral from this same perspective. And our grasslands representative has jumped ship, so she now gets to represent both sides of the conversation potentially as well there. So would you all like to have that as a conversation? We had wanted to target in on some of the remote sensing issues and approaches, some of which we've just been touching on here. But that's our last meeting. So I wanted to get input as to what you all would like to focus on for that final meeting.
I'll just say, I had the break, we talked a little bit about this, and so, a bit of time, I've come up with like 6 or 7 names of people.
All right.
For
All right.
to potentially reach out to talk about both grasslands and shrublands, if folks want to do that.
I think that would be appropriate because we had a bit of a dive on wetlands. It was very minimal dive on agriculture, Will. So I don't know if there's something that you would want to revisit there, because that particular conversation was more limited. But we can come back to that. But I personally think that coming back to grasslands and chaparral would be beneficial in terms of both the ARB process and the CNRA on implementation, or CNRA and DFA implementation sides. Other thoughts?
Yeah, I just had one question from the state side, if there are particular things that are. I mean, we have some advisory capacity, so there's things that the state folks want to have some discussion of, given. Yeah, I'd be interested to know that also.
So
if this is what's needed, or if there's other
CNRA or ARB, if there are additional elements, because certainly they posed some of the questions that led to your significant disposition on these approaches. But let's have as a core the grasslands and chaparral approaches. And
I think we can come up with this question similar.
Yeah, or if there's like Laura's insinuating, other sorts of things that we might want to know about. Right?
Yeah, the things that aren't necessarily related to shrublands. I mean, there might be some very shrubland grassland things that, got it. But if there are any other things that we haven't gotten to this year that.
I mean, just real quick off the top of my head, this discussion about barriers to implementation and solutions to those barriers, that would be interesting to hear about across all of the landscapes. So there's that.
I know there was a number of that type of work laid out in the recommendations.
Yeah.
In the pathway part of the recommendations. And maybe it's worth kind of diving into some of those. We are hoping to put out a draft of the 2025 Climate Smart Land Strategy soon. I'm hoping that it'll be before that meeting, but it may not be.
That was great. That was months ago.
Yeah,
it's a core focus for us, but
and
we were unable to do that.
Yeah, and I mean, the floor is really open. Like, we're open. You guys know what barriers and solutions are out there. They're experts in this space. So,
if they're creative solutions, also, this is a nice platform to, surface them.
Yeah, and our idea in the draft is just to lay out what we've heard over the past 5 years or so of this is what's out there as far as barriers and solutions. So, I know you guys know this.
Any prioritization or setting of that?
Not necessarily for the draft.
Okay, because we worked fairly hard within our process to hone in on things that were practical, known, could be done right now, as opposed to a broad spectrum of all ideas. So it sounds like you're going to go to the broad spectrum of all ideas
There's some internal, we do want to put the broad list out there for the general public to weigh in on, to see what folks have to say. I think that there's a lot of state process that also has to go into saying we will do this, including sign off from the Department of Finance and the governor's office and folks like that. So it's at this point, we're trying to lay out what we've heard and be responsive to many years of input, at least for the draft. But again, this is just a public comment draft. It's not the final strategy will come out sometime next year.
All right, well, it sounds like it would be potentially challenging to get any feedback on the draft strategy because we don't know the timing of its release relative to our meeting.
Yeah, and we will, if there is interest in giving specific input on the draft, it doesn't have to happen at a meeting per se. So in the targets, you guys gave us a written document, and there wasn't necessarily an exact meeting that lined up with. So it's, it doesn't have to be a meeting necessarily. But again, I think you all have a lot of expertise about what you would say anyway, without seeing a draft list of queries and solutions.
Theoretically, we felt we said it.
Great.
In the report.
And that's also great. That's also great. If you want to just say, hey, read our past report, that's great.
We did put a fair bit of
Yeah.
effort in
Yeah.
trying to come up with something that was usable, but
yeah, and if
we'll wait with interest to see what comes out. And okay, well,
yes, before we end.
How, but and at this point we have, it looks like two members of the public still on, one of whom may or may not be able to. So any public comment coming from we will take silence as assent as opposed to Mr. Moore's approach to silence, for those of you who are students of history. All right, well, thank you, everybody. And we'll give you back 7 minutes or 8.